To wrestle back from, but we'll see how today goes. My name is Matt Marinis. It's a pleasure to be hosting this second workshop. We have a lot to cover in a few hours today. The reason for the shorter version of this meeting versus last time we unpacked a lot of technical details. A lot of those technical details were tied to a batch 0A concept, a batch 0B concept. Jeff will talk about how we are on a change of direction right now and what does it look like to realign to a stakeholder process solution. And so we're going to be talking about market feedback today. We're going to be talking about what does it look like to address some of the major concerns that we've heard from the community. And then ERCOT won't spend as much time on the technical piece. I will say this, if I forget though, the original technical substance is in the appendix of the ERCOT presentation that we posted. So let me just go ahead and get us the antitrust admonition off, and then we'll get up and running. So I'll let you read that on the screen. While you're reading that on the screen, if you want to get in the queue and you're in the room, we'd encourage you to join the WebEx link. That will allow you to say, I have a question. There's no way to see hands in the room. So we're going to use the WebEx message function to say, I have a question, and we'll try to manage that like last time. Hopefully not 30 people in the queue at a time. The second piece, if you do use WebEx, please mute your computer on entry, the microphone and that. Like no audio, I think, is the option you can use. So join the WebEx with no audio. So antitrust admonition. And then priority. Let me tell you right now when our next workshop is, so you can mark your calendars. So today is Thursday, February 12th. Next Thursday is the Large Load Working Group. That will not be a deep dive meeting. We're going to do I call it a show you where we're at meeting. So if you want to log in and listen to LLWG, that's the Large Load Working Group, for an hour, ERCOT is going to start to say, we think these are the elements that need to be put into this new NPRR. The week following that, ERCOT will walk through that draft NPRR. So the main thing you want to circle on your calendar is February 26th, 9:30 to whenever. That is an all-day workshop on the new rules of the road for batch 0, as ERCOT knows as best they do at that point in time. So this is very much a collaboration and a partnership. You're going to hear over and over again, we have heard a lot of feedback. We are doing our best to navigate the waters. Everyone has their story, and one solution will not fit everyone's story, but we're doing our best to find what is predictable, what's understood, and what's reasonable to move forward. So thank you for the feedback. This is definitely ERCOT partnership of bringing together something, I think Jeff said it well, it's in pencil. We're open to feedback so we don't get it wrong, and then we come back with the next one. So that was and then the last thing is, this has been a frequently asked question, is what's up with the comments? So we received comments from 30 plus companies. We put that into a zip file. The way the zip file works is it downloads to your machine. Heaven help you if you have a Mac. I can't help you there. Ask your kid. And so what will happen is you open up the zip file, and thank you, Janice Asen, for helping to put this together. We have now put a README on the top of it. So if you don't know, if you forget everything I say, double-click the README to explain how to open the hyperlink. But watch this one. So if you go ahead and click this, you're going to open an email and be disappointed and say, where's the beef? And what you do is you double-click on this or copy this link, and that will then launch an Adobe file that will see either the Word document, the PDF, the PowerPoint presentation, whatever it was, and you can see it. I will say personally, as ERCOT, I'm excited that we did this process because you're seeing a lot of the slides that ERCOT saw. This is a chance for a lot of people to tell their story of why they think that this idea is so critical to this. And so, again, we'll try to summarize. Jesse, God bless him. Jesse did a great job trying to summarize all of this different input and to try to synthesize it into key points.
Like that.
All right. And so let me go ahead and set the stage for the day, and we will continue on. Close. Okay, back to our regular meeting. All right, so Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and open this and turn the first part over to you. Since the last workshop, things have changed a bit. Oh, I'm sorry. So let me just kind of give you the day. I voiced over this. Let me get you a line of sight to it. We're going to start with a brief update on what the PUC guidance was on this process. We're then going to have, let's call it a deeper dive on the stakeholder feedback received. Two things happened since the last meeting. You had a survey that you could complete online, and we have data behind to share. And there's also the idea of those emailed comments that came in that were publicly posted so everyone can see everybody's thoughts. So that'll be where Jesse helps to lead that piece. And then it's the market, the ERCOT feedback on the key market topics. So after the last workshop, we heard loud and clear there's 12 things that are really important. And Jeff's been walking around with that at the commission and at the board meeting, and these are the 12 things. So it's a chance to pull the thread a little more on some of those, but also to say there's more work to be done. But we will touch on each of those. And then next steps, I will start to lay out the trajectory that we believe we're on for this partnership together of solving all these problems in the next, before June 1st. All right, so Jeff, you're the first slide on the PUC meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So Jeff Bilow with ERCOT. When we initially started getting feedback from stakeholders, what we heard was, hey, we support ERCOT's move to a batch study process. However, we heard this from developers and from TSPs as well, but primarily from developers that said, we have a project that is somewhere in the current interconnection process, and it is stuck in the current interconnection process. And so we like this batch study idea, but we need to get unstuck from the current process. And we need to do that quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty now that ERCOT's announced that you're going to do a batch study process. We have a lot of uncertainty with what that is going to look like. And so we took that feedback, and we're pursuing this idea of having a quick transition to a batch study, which we called batch 0, that would be before an ongoing batch study process, batch 1, and so on. And so that was our initial idea, and in order to effect that quickly, we had been thinking that we would do a good cause exception that would allow us to not continue the current process while we're doing this batch 0 process, and then eventually we would work through some revision request that would codify the batch 1 and so on. So at that's what we've been talking. We heard feedback at the workshop last week, and then at the open meeting when we presented our update to the commission, the commissioners indicated that their preference was for ERCOT not to do a good cause exception, but rather to, I'll say, sort of take our time. And I think the message was that we need to get it right. And a better process to make sure that we do that would be to implement batch 0 as a revision request. However, they also expressed that we need to still move quickly through that revision request process. So this cannot be a revision request that we, sits in the stakeholder process for half a year or anything like that. We've got to move this quickly because those same stakeholders, those developers that have that uncertainty and want to move their projects quickly, that still exists. But the more, I think the feedback we heard was that the more right size timeline was a June board approval of that revision request. And so that is the path that we are now on. Is we are internally we are developing a revision request. I would say we're still, I think, debating if that is just an NPRR or if that's an NPRR and a PGRR. We'll lay out a little bit. I think Matt's going to lay out kind of what our plan is here in a minute for that. For how do we get to the June board with that revision request. But the commissioners, and in particularly the chairman, very strongly indicated that we need to hit that June board date. This can't linger for a long time, and so we have a lot of work to do, and it is a lot of work, but we are confident that we can get that work done in time to get to a June board decision. In parallel to that, a lot of the feedback that we've heard is that stakeholders are really interested in the bring your own generation or co-located generation concept, as well as CLR concept. However, we also know that there's a lot of work to do there, and so priority is to get batch zero. We will have a batch zero revision request for the June board. We will attempt to also bring the bring our generation and CLR revision request at that same time. But if we end up having issues in the stakeholder process that don't allow us to move those at the same time as batch zero, then we will have to accept that. So I think the message from the commission was, yes, these are important. Yes, you should work on them. You should try to get them in for batch zero, but we don't want to sacrifice batch zero if you can't go, because there's a lot of words that need to be put on paper and in the protocols to make those happen. So that is the plan for that. And then lastly, wanted to note that the current process, which we affectionately call PIGR 115 process, but it's essentially the Planning Guide Section 9 process, that is still in effect. And we are still going through that process where we are, studies are still happening. We are still approving studies. We are still approving energization plans based on that process that's laid out in Planning Guide Section 9. So let me, actually, before I take any questions, Matt, do you want to kind of lay out the plan to get us from now to the June board?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for kind of framing that out. So we have our marching orders, which is June board. Unfortunately, it's June 1st board, which means we're back to now May 24th, which means that's the last chance for a TAC approval, which means the PRS approval. So it's that, how do you backstack or backtrack out what's our critical path? And it's not easy. It's a squeeze. And so let me kind of show you. This is an initial cut from ERCOT team looking at this. And TAC leadership is also considering options on how to ensure a successful review and approval. Because, for example, we're not all just going to walk into TAC on May 24th and hope that we're going to make it through. So it's the idea of what does it look like to take the necessary votes along the way if needed. And so let's just talk about getting out of the gate. And again, I'll hit this at the end too, so I'll try to be quick now to get to the content. But the idea is we're here to workshop today. Large Load Working Group I talked about, that's our stopover next week, is just a 1-hour time slot of how we're doing this. And then this workshop will be the draft NPR language, and that is on February 26th. So that is the chance to get into that piece. And then the idea is almost in every other week cadence to work through these issues. As the chair of this group, my job is to figure out how to take a lot of issues with a lot of people and narrow it down. These all need to be public forums, and so we may have boxed out days to where it's 90 minutes on this topic and we're going to switch to the next one, so people know when to be here, when to lock in and get this stuff done. And so again, there's a lot of details to come as to which of these and how they unfold. What are the big issues? What are the easy issues? And getting through it. And as we get into the April and May, this may become an ERCOT-led workshop that starts to transition into special PRS meetings or special TAC meetings. And so April, May may look like a lot of special meetings on that side. So that's still to be determined. But suffice it to say, lots of meetings, lots of communication, and a lot of work to do. In parallel to this is the idea that PRS is the first stop for approving an NPR, if you're not aware of that. And then it goes to TAC, and then it goes to the board. In the event that there's an accompanying planning guide revision request, this PIGR, that would then also need ROS updates along the way and ultimately a vote. So that may not be needed. That stream may not be needed. And then as we get to TAC, it's obviously going to be monthly updates to that group to get to the TAC vote and or special meetings. So this is a starting point, not the finishing point. and then ultimately the ERCOT board, and of course the board will have interest of where we're at in April. So that's the high-level piece, and again, with a target approval of the board on that June 1st meeting, would then set the stage for PUC approval at some point and a protocol effective date on August 1st. So I guess take any clarifying questions here. Okay, yeah.
Hey Matt, actually, before you do that, there's something I meant to mention and forgot to. I want to go back to the batch zero. So when we had originally been thinking of this, we had thought that we would start, if we went the good cause exception route, we would start a batch zero, call it phase A, in late March, early April, and then we would perform that, and then we would do a more comprehensive phase B of batch zero, latter half of this year, call it. I think with the change in the time, we no longer believe that we have the that time to do a two-phase approach, because that would put batch one just too far out. And there are likely, and criteria, we'll work through this when we get to the revision request, but criteria for which of the large load interconnection request projects go into batch zero and which are going to be in batch one. We don't want batch one to be too far out. And so because of that, we are moving away from a two-phase approach to batch zero, and we will just have a single batch zero study followed by batch one. So the idea is that at every single project, we want to be able to move through either batch zero or batch one, so that this is not this whole process does not cause a delay or much of a delay for projects that are currently in the process. So.
Good clarification. Thank you, Jeff. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish people in the queue, so let's just work that real quick. Katie Coleman, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Katie Coleman for TIC. I was just wondering if you guys are envisioning a combined NPRR or two separate NPRRs for the CLR and bring your own generation proposals.
Yeah, AG will hit that in a minute. We're going to keep them decoupled, but what do you call it? Collectively boltable together, if that's even a word. When I say boltable, it would mean let's create the batch study framework, and if the CLR concept can be vetted and fit together to where it can be approved at the same time and it all fits together, that would then be the batch process and the CLR. But it would be separate NPRs for that as well as the co-located generation. So potentially 3 NPRs that all fit together, but the thing that we cannot miss is getting that batch process NPR across the finish line. All right. Next question, Sam Jung.
Sam Jung, EPE. Just probably speaking for a lot of developers here. If you go to Sideback, there's a comment on the current PGR's process remains in effect, and the large load customers will continue to support when they approve. What does approved mean? Would that mean, I guess that will be considered in as a firm load in the batch zero, whatever, I guess the detail will, reveal itself. But do you mind explain a little more on that?
Yeah, so I think what we mean here is that we are going to continue to follow the process as laid out in Planning Guide Section 9. What that means for batch zero, I think we don't know yet. We heard feedback, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, heard feedback, and so as we are drafting the rules for batch zero, we will take that feedback into account.
All right. Thank you. Prashanth.
Hey, this is Prashant from Black Mountain. I think you answered my first question. Basically, there will be only one batch instead of 2 batch zeros. Other question was regarding the requirements. I'm sure you might be touching on this. So the cutoff requirements that we had initially for batch zero, or batch zero being the previous one. So basically, ERCOT is going to revise those and update through the NPR or PGRR process, and basically update the stakeholders through those, and basically the qualifications for June start for the batch zero process. Is that right?
Well, taking dates off that, we are now on to a new process. So the current processes established are still in effect. Dates or things that we brought forward as part of Batch 0A and 0B are no longer applicable, and we are on this new track for this Batch 0 process, NPR and timing. And the protocols would go into effect on August 1st, and at that point is the green light for ERCOT to proceed with that batch process. Again, one of the things we'll talk about later in the meeting, I don't want to get stuck on it here, is dates. We heard loud and clear about how dates are important to you guys, and so that would be, well, we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay? I hope that clarifies.
Thanks.
All right, you bet. Eric Goff. I saw you. Oh, are you unplugged? You connected? There you go.
Had to connect a wire in order to serve this load. Just real briefly on the schedule, and I know we all know this, but I think it would be useful for us, given the high-profile nature of this, to plan for special meetings if we need voting bodies, if we need to, in order to keep on our schedule.
Yes, agreed. All right. Next, Bill Barnes.
Yeah, I think on that same line, Bill Barnes, NRG, is one, appreciate the timeline layout here. We will brace ourselves for many workshops, which makes sense. We are supportive of a modified, potentially ad hoc stakeholder approval process where we can accelerate this. I do think in the past, I know Ann's not here, but maybe Corey's, we have done combined meetings with PRS and Ross, and maybe some of those later workshops can act as those forums where we can make sure we move rule sets through quickly. So that's one first comment is we're very supportive of making adjustments to the stakeholder review process and approval process if we need to. The second is some of these topics are pretty meaty. Are we planning to design the workshop schedule where we're going to talk about, say, BYOG at workshop 3 or CLRs at workshop 3, or is that what we're thinking on the workshops? Is there going to be dedicated subject matter for specific? Okay, appreciate
Yes.
that. Thanks.
Strong yes. Those will have to be, because if we get everyone in a room and just say, hey, what do we want to talk about? It can't be that way. It's 90 minutes on dynamic studies or 90 minutes on this, and we just hit it hard. All right. Next, and I see that, Caitlin just chimed in. Tech Leadership is working with ERCOT stakeholders to get those other meetings for April and May. So by the end of this week, we'll have a schedule for the balance of February and March meetings, and then we'll figure out how that couples and fits together with the stakeholder meetings. So that'll get us through the first sprint of 6 weeks. Okay. Sorry, I lost the cue. I'm sorry. Corey, can you help me? Is it Haynes is next? Haynes Strader? Thanks. Go ahead, Haynes.
Thank you. Haynes Strader with Skybox Data Centers. On that third bullet on that slide on PGRR 115, I recognize that's guidance from the PUC. Does ERCOT intend to follow that guidance, just to be clear?
Yes.
Thank you.
They better.
All right. Well, thank you. All right. Shilpi. And Shilpi, if you're talking, we don't hear you yet. We're going to go on next. I'll come back to you, Shilpi, in a minute. Sunil. All right, that makes the queue faster. Kevin Hansen.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Figure 122 has not been resolved yet, but I'm sure it has an impact on the answer here. Do we need to resolve that prior to the batch process, or is it going to be incorporated into the NPR/figure that we're looking at?
So figure 122 we think can go in parallel.
Okay, if we don't finalize that, though, are we going to assume we have infinite capabilities, or are we going to limit it in the study?
Right now in the 115 process, we don't have that limitation in there. So I would say it's, again, we see this as parallel.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I'm going to go back to Shilpi. Are you back online?
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Sorry about that. Some glitch on my end. So, this is Shilpi Sunil Kumar with Mara, and a quick clarification on the slide where you said that since PUCT has requested to follow the stakeholder process, you mentioned something about that batch 0A and 0B is not a path we would be thinking forward, going forward. So trying to understand that now that the stakeholder process as it happens, the current projects which are already in the queue will follow under the current protocols, and then what exactly would batch 0 mean for the new process? Would that still try to move some of the already filed projects into that batch, or would that be for all the new projects that come in after, say, the June or July or whatever date we all agree upon?
Sorry, Jeff, that's a technical question that hasn't been addressed yet, but Jeff, if you want to take a shot at when we can answer that question, I think it's much later in the process.
Yeah, so batch 0 will be...
So, Shilpi, if you can mute your phone, as we're talking, it's pinging back off your wall into the microphone. Sorry, if you can mute your microphone while we respond. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so batch 0 will be a transitional batch process intended for, I'll say, some projects that are currently in the current interconnection process. And what exactly that criteria is, I think will be defined in the revision request.
All right. Thank you, Jeff, for clarifying.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. So Ian and then Shannon, at that point, we'll try to wind this down and move on to the next topic.
Thanks, Matt. Ian Haley, Morgan Stanley. Hoping on the calendar we can actually schedule a few extra workshops towards the end. Meetings are much easier to cancel than they are to fit back into the calendar. So thrilled to cancel meetings if we don't need them, but towards the end I think we might have a mad rush where we need to come back on a topic 1 or 2 extra times.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's easier to cancel the meeting than to find a spot. Okay. All right. Good feedback. Shannon and then Sandeep, and then we'll wrap it up at that point.
On the same theme as Ian, I'd like to recommend if y'all are filing on March 4th your batch 0 revision request, currently on the calendar like Friday the 6th, there's not really anything else out there that conflicts. If ERCOT could hold a workshop then, sort of similar to a little bit of what you did the one week ago Tuesday, explaining, giving a good verbal and slide presentation walkthrough of your NPRR, I think that'd be helpful to all of us to more quickly digest what it means and get that dialogue.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Good suggestion. If there's a chance to, we talk about the draft at the end of February, we drop the NPR first week of March. Is there a follow-on meeting to unpack it a little bit?
Yeah,
okay.
Like on Friday the 6th.
And that could even be a WebEx or something just to push out information. Okay, thank you. All right, Sandeep, last question on this topic.
Thanks, Matt. This is Sandeep with Sandeep Burkhar with LCRA. I know we have until June to get this reviewed and approved. I'll urge us as stakeholders to maybe prioritize the criteria for inclusion in these batches earlier, so it gives us TSPs enough time to start collecting the necessary information, so we don't wait to start our work in June and then take another month to get you what you need to get these loads added. That will be helpful. There is already one framework out there for the RTP compliance plan. If you can somehow reference that and make it the same effort as a whole for the TSP, that will help us speed up a lot of our work.
All right, thanks, Sandeep. All right. Well, we're going to bring Jesse back up here again on the feedback, a key, all your feedback. What a story to tell. Here you go, Jesse. All right. Voting is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Good to see you all again. We're going to spend, we'll see what the time is, but call it a little less than an hour on some of the stakeholder feedback that we've seen for the last month and a half, 2 months. What I'd just like to make some upfront comments here. So first off, I've tried to lay out kind of some of the forums and the formats for feedback that we've had. We had the stakeholder interviews that many of you participated in. We had a bit of a readout of that last week. Obviously, the attendance was pretty fantastic on the workshop last week as well, and there was quite a bit of feedback in the way of questions. Coming out of that, we sent out a formal survey, and that's what I'll spend the bulk of the time on this morning. But we received over 100 responses from different organizations, and quite a bit of written comments and kind of the free text box as well. And then finally, as Matt showed at the beginning, we've got a folder of the filed public comments that came in after the workshop as well. And I'm going to link those to the feedback that you'll hear in the stakeholder survey and give you a bit of a rundown there. The nice call out here is that obviously the workshop and the questions that were asked during that are entirely public, and the comments that were filed are as well. And then we've taken as much as we could in an anonymous way, as we sort of promised, to provide the feedback that you can actually see from the interviews as well as the survey itself. And just some grounding points here. So one, when we go through the survey, it needs to be taken in context. Obviously, the decision coming out of the PUCT on Friday changes a bit some of the way you may have answered the question, as these were submitted before that came through. We also know that it is very helpful to have things like radio buttons, pick A, B, or C, and we can segment and pivot and sort of present the data. But that when you start to file things into very discrete answers, that there's some context that probably comes with what's going into the answer. So we're not taking these as prescriptive, but as part of the overall arc of the input we've heard from stakeholders. I also just want to say this is a good place to hear the feedback from others. So whether it's someone within your community, it's another TDSP if you're in a TDSP, or as large loads that are attempting to interconnect wires companies, generators, depending on who you are, understand that ERCOT is working to come to a set of revisions that satisfy the system and move the state forward. And so kind of getting a better sense for what some of your peers and then folks from other constituencies are actually thinking through can be helpful. We've seen in making this process, I think, successful and understanding kind of the puts and takes that are inherent in doing anything of this magnitude. And then I would also say just the responses in some cases, we are interpreting as an outcome, and in some cases the question is actually getting at, what would you do in X situation, or what is your preferred outcome? In many cases, what we're seeing is there's a root cause behind that's driving the answer. And so what we've tried to do is link, in some of our feedback notes, link what are the root causes and the symptoms of the problems, as opposed to, how would you change the outcome symptom to just create a kind of a Band-Aid fix for the overall system. And then I'm going to go through the survey. It's a bit long. I think it is worth some of the voiceover to kind of hit the points that I've talked about now. And then, obviously you'll have access to the PowerPoints online. You can read the more detailed comments. This will be recorded. And so this puts a nice record into it to reference later. I will say that what was interesting across the 32 questions, of which 20 are various multiple choice radio, multiple tick buttons, there is no button that was either unanimously selected or not selected at all, which means that there's no question where we could get an agreement on everyone across the group. In some ways that makes the job difficult, and in other ways you'd say, okay, what that means is that this is inherently a process of compromise. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the survey first, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on the comments, just tying them back together. For those that were in the survey didn't take it, I just sort of want to ground you. First off, we had 109 responses. Of that, 2/3 were folks that we had interviewed before in the stakeholder process, and if you kind of do the math on that, it means virtually everyone who was in an interview also submitted a survey. So thank you for, again, continue to take the time. And then what we've done in the feedback here, this segmentation on the right, is meant to give a bit of a visual on how different stakeholder groups kind of align to answers. Obviously, every organization actually has nuances and differences, but we've grouped into the TDSPs the customers who are seeking to interconnect, And then other, and you see in the bulk of other that's the independent generators, the IPPs are kind of the at least I guess it's majority, even more than plurality of that. And so you'll see those segments as we go through on the bar charts. And then what we've tried to do is also synthesize the comments in the end, because in a lot of these cases, it is necessary to clarify what was intended by a selection of the boxes, because they're quite prescriptive. Okay, so we grouped it into these 8 categories, and so I will go through them. As you see, there's 32 questions. 20 are multiple choice, and then there's 12 free text. I will try to highlight what we think was important or is not necessarily going to jump off the page. But you all have these materials. You have access to the materials. They're quite long to read, and in some ways, I think getting through them is hopefully quite instructive. And we know this has felt in a lot of cases like a bit of a, I don't want to say black box, but maybe you're sort of shouting into the void. We know there are a lot of strong opinions and various pain points that have been voiced and ideas on how to improve the process. Part of the goal of today and this session is to give you a bit of the flavor back of what we've heard. I don't want to pretend that everything that I'm representing to you is exactly the full weight of what we've heard, but we're trying to condense it so that you at least get the flavor and hopefully feel heard. And if you feel like actually we've misinterpreted grossly, that'll give you a chance to understand and correct. But the worst case scenario in a process like this is we take a lot of feedback in and no one hears anything back as far as how that's been incorporated. And then we get to the end and it's unclear and the process doesn't actually land somewhere that's helpful for everyone. So I want to go through the questions, and I'll start with this first one as an orientation. So the slides will be similar in this format throughout. We have the question on top, and here the question that was posed, and it's word for word from the survey. I've printed out a copy. The answers at the bottom are synthesized a bit because we wanted to fit the text on the screen. We'll make sure that the survey questions are available. But the question here is should the transmission or distribution service provider offer a preliminary screening study assessment before requiring entry into the batch? And so what we saw was, either everyone, and by yes for all here is everyone above 75 megawatts, or maybe we create a second tier, sort of large loads. What was suggested in the question was 500 megawatts or above, where for these exceptionally large loads, there's preliminary studies before they are entered, or actually no. The TDSPs should be taking the process as is and should be sending them to ERCOT once the applications come in. And what you'll see is it's a relatively even distribution across the 3 questions, across these 3 groups. And at the same time, what you would see is that over 80%, so what we would call a strong majority here, would suggest that some sort of TDSP screening before actually landing on a submission to ERCOT would be helpful. And so this is a good example of a question where we would say that while it's not unanimous, there's a strong preference that as those requests come in, what we're hearing is that there's some process that the wires companies are able to screen to ensure that there's some level of realism or feasibility to the project. Okay.
So you do have a question. You can finish this slide, but I'll allow a couple questions, but we have 34 slides to go through, so we'll see how this goes.
So I'll pause there, and maybe we figure out what the cadence should look like, because it does look like there's quite a few things popping up on the screen.
Just 2, fortunately, but Eric, go ahead.
So you tell me, would it be useful for people to talk about answers in this meeting, or just read the slides as they come across?
I think our main thing was to remind people what was asked. So I'm sorry. We had a debate internally as the idea, are we really going to go through every one of these? And the answer is yes. You took the time to do it. We're going to show you where you are in the story. Is the phrase we've been using is, I've said this, but everybody else said that. I don't know why. That's going to be a tough nut to crack in the coming weeks. So we're not trying to solve everything today, but I think it's fair to throw a couple of comments out there if we want to, and then let it go, and on we go. But
just like practically, I think we should make a choice, because if this is the commission asked us to have a stakeholder-driven conversation about how to move this forward, we should probably talk about do we do this or not for all the next 35 questions, right? But do you want to do that today or not?
Yeah, I'd rather get through them all with a couple of clarifying questions, and then at the end, if we want to try to conclude. Because we did take these 34 questions and synthesize it into what are the top 15 things to consider. And then maybe we talk about those being topics we need to drill into.
Okay.
So we tried to boil it down already.
I appreciate that.
All right. We'll see how time goes. Okay, so Clayton? Nope. All right. Prashant? Oh, I'm sorry. Shannon Caraway and then Prashant.
I'll make this really quick, and this in the structure you want. On subsequent ones, I'll reserve. I'd just say on this, as long as you make it optional, if y'all do it, make it optional. It makes it to where if those want to do it, they can. They don't. It's not an obligation.
Thank you. Prashant?
Yeah, my question was exactly the same as Shannon. Is it optional or compulsory? Because if it is mandatory, each TSP is going to take their time to do the screening studies, and it can have some impact. So mostly optional.
All right. Thank you. Chris?
Chris Montes, Google. I'm absolutely going to object to optional. It's either one or the other. The biggest frustrations for loads is the lack of uniformity from TDSP to TSP.
All right. Evan?
I'm not going to talk about the merit of screening studies, but rather just throw out there sooner rather than later. I really like the breakdown you guys have by like customers versus TSPs and others, but it'd be really helpful if we get that broken down into voting segments so we could really see where consensus would shake out at places like TAC or PRS, like TSPs. I mean, I think there's like 3 voting segments kind of shaped into that, so just something to consider.
Yeah, and maybe as part of the task force, we talk about when we need to issue a survey and how should we structure it. Okay, thanks, Evan. We clear? Meaningful when TSPs have. So just a comment came in. Screening study by TDSPs is meaningful when TDSPs have visibility over large load queue across all TDSPs. All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to turn you loose to the next slide, Jesse.
Okay, and I will say we've ordered these as the survey goes, and so there'll be it'll feel a little bit of jumping around based on the comments. I think you'll hear, Chris, from the comment you just made, that shows up quite a bit around consistency across. So the next one is actually, how should ERCOT ensure consistency if there's an initial study quality across the TDSPs? And what we heard was to standardize. So the first and second box includes standardization. And then the question here was whether the ERCOT's making the process sort of designing as the central body versus the TSPs sort of collaborating to come up with that process. I think across either of those, you'd expect a lot of discussion. There was a non-zero, but a minority set of folks who responded that they'd actually prefer to see the process remain kind of with the TSPs and individual. And if you do it as kind of a weighting, you'd say it's slightly weighted toward the TSPs would say to retain that process. I think we'll go to the next one. And by the way, this first block of A, this is about kind of the initial intake and screening. The next question was actually, what should be the communication path and the relationship between ERCOT and the large load developer? This room is aware, but formally, there is not a formal relationship between the load and ERCOT in most instances. And so what we saw or what we heard was, continue to basically for the first two, the 80-some% in the first two boxes would say that there's some process where ERCOT is either directly communicating or actually has a formal relationship with the load, which may either start with the TSP or actually start with ERCOT going forward. And so what we at least take from that is that the relationship, when we talk about large loads on the system, the relationship of those loads with ERCOT may need to be closer going forward, or there's a sense that would be helpful. Well, again, a non-zero minority, particularly weighted toward the wires companies, would suggest that actually the current status quo, where the formal relationship sits with the wires and the further relationship with ERCOT is between the TSP and ERCOT, may be the right way to continue.
All right, I see a question from Fareed.
Fareed with EPE. Is ERCOT planning on having an online portal similar to Rio to manage those large requests, similar to what we have for generation?
Hey, Fareed, this is A.G. Springer, ERCOT. Yes, I'm going to be covering that in one of the later slides, but that is the long-term plan.
All right, on you go, Jesse.
And then we go to the fourth question here. This one regarding feedback to the TDSPs and ERCOT's delayed responses. What are appropriate next steps to consider? And so we heard through the stakeholder process and through the workshop last week and comments, real concerns with kind of where material is passed back and forth, lack of visibility and transparency into the process itself, a lot of frustration from the loads about understanding where they sit and when they could potentially even find out whether or not they'll be energized. And so the question was framed essentially as, more transparency to solve the issue. As long as you know where things are you more comfortable with that, or do we actually need to look at standardizing the process? And I think this was about as close to unanimous as we'd seen for any question, that it's not just about transparency, although we heard that that'll be helpful, but that an actual standardization across the process, particularly with dates communicated ahead of time and milestones and allowing for more planning and more control, I think, on the load side. And this wasn't just from the load customers. This was across the set of stakeholders.
All right, quick question from Joelle.
Hey, good morning. Can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I just want to ask a quick question. In the previous slide, I heard that there were some comments on maybe also revising the threshold. So instead of 75, maybe some comments came through for large load above 500. I just want to ask ERCOT, are we considering any threshold now other than the 75? Or is 75 really above 75 we're studying, we're going with a TSP that does studies, reviews by ERCOT, PGRR 115, or is there any consideration for other thresholds?
I think for the process as a whole, it's still 75.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Jeff, if you don't mind me adding in on that. This is Barksdale from the PUC. I think that 75 megawatt threshold is being established in rule and not here in the ERCOT process. And while that has not been formally adopted by the Commission at this point, I think that remains staff's strong recommendation.
All right, thank you, Barksdale. Shannon.
This may be covered elsewhere, or it may be summarized up in here, so I'll say it here. One of the comments I had at the last meeting is that, in the section 1 of the protocols, the 1.3.1.2, like 1A, is any load flow models, any data in there, including data on any load in there, is strictly not confidential. And same way over in Planning Guide Section 9, it's been recognized there. Part of this transparency is making the input cases into the batch, the ones that made it in, transparent, making what comes out of the back of the batch transparent. You'll do that on, CRRs. You've done it on many, many other things. Doing that here, it will be part of the transparency it'll really help people. And I think to the degree screening studies were optional, it'll cut down on people's desire to go engage the TSP to do that, because they'll have the most recent set of batches that went in, and then go hire their own consultant to do studies off of that in a really productive way that may be more productive than what the TSPs might or might not do themselves.
Thanks, Shannon. I see Andrew Shaper jumped in and agreed also. All right, proceed on, Jesse.
Moving on. So to end this section, we had a free text question basically around the challenges with delayed responses and what are some of the next steps to consider. I won't read the whole slide to you, but I would highlight the top 2 points that we've heard over and over again, and it has certainly resonated internally, that there's a need for clarity and transparency, as well as standardization of processes. The frustration across different parts of the state, across the holdups in different pieces of the process, and a lack of clarity on how to move projects forward is something that came through quite clearly. What that also links to, if you look toward the second half of the page, is getting a better cadence and a better method for communication between ERCOT as well as the TDSPs and the large load developers. I think we will talk about, AGO mentioned in the future, what the portal or what the kind of the standard data availability should look like going forward. And there is something around consistency across TDSPs. So it doesn't feel like you're kind of winning or losing depending on which set of wires you're connecting to. The one thing that's really important are the last words on the slide, which is, you can introduce new processes to sort of improve this. But what needs to happen is not a set of new bottlenecks or a set of new hurdles to jump through that actually slows everything down. So transparency without lack of forward motion is also a concern. Okay.
Very good. And tell you what, as we go into the next, so you notice we just made it through the A's, and there's 8 of these. So as we go through the B's, we'll just pause at the end of B for a couple clarifying questions, then we'll go on to C. So rather than stopping at each slide, when we get to this summary slide for each section, we'll pause there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jesse.
And they're not all this long, but we don't want to miss the chance to hear back from you as well. Okay, so the section B really has to do with eligibility criteria. Going into this, and this was largely anchored on the batch 0A and 0B process that was discussed last time, which, as you just heard, likely going to be changed pretty substantially. What we don't want to do is throw out the input, though, because we think there is quite a bit of valuable information here. So this first slide really here is the question that we asked was, and maybe I won't read all of the words to you, but really understanding, based on the proposal, how should projects be considered to be put into a batch? We know that going into the batch 0A in particular, there was a lot of questions and feedback to understand, how do I get my project into the earliest batch possible to get connected? But the idea that there is some set of screening or some set of criteria, really the first and the third, we ordered these. This is a different order than the questions came up. We ordered them in terms of sort of the height of the bars to try to make it clear, was a majority, nearly 2/3 across the first 3 bars. The first and the third bar to us really are about, verifying that a project is real, non-speculative, and has a chance to energize. So bringing financial security and having some sort of criteria to show for operational readiness. We also, if you look at the second one, a criteria around the date that it's submitted to the TSP or the date that it lands at ERCOT, which is the third from the right, those 2 numbers add up to 100%. Meaning, a something around the chronology is important, but we would say there's a 2-to-1 preference for things that are in the control of the large load, which means the submission date, as opposed to when the communication happens between ERCOT and the TSPs. And then there was not a sharp fall off, but a fall off in understanding kind of what the other appropriate intakes would be. So bring your own generation, I know, is a topic that is going to come up multiple times throughout this presentation. The same with the controllable load resources. We see those as options as not a firm load in the traditional sense, but options to bring flexibility to the system to move the projects forward. We understood, particularly from developers, that there's a lot of interest in that, and you'll see that the darker blue bar, which includes the generators, had a higher weighting toward those responses. I will say that the date-based requests, the energization, and then the current status through the process, there was some concern in the free text around and in the comments around those being things that could be more easily gamed. And we wouldn't accuse anyone of not bringing a load that they didn't think is real, but we recognize that the process is challenging to get through, and there's lots of rationale for why you kind of put together an application that you think most likely represents an outcome that is coincident with what you would like to see. So that's a lot of words to say that some concern around things like energization date, which is an easy number to change on the application, which is very different than operational readiness criteria. But as I mentioned, there was a lot of concern out of the first workshop around what did it mean to be in 0A versus 0B versus batch 1. That will be timelines, dates, what those batches look like will have changed, but we want to continue to take the input from this into consideration. Okay? So I'll move on to the next question, where I think we heard the strongest feedback even in the room during the questions, which is, should ERCOT allow a grace period for projects to meet the batch 0 eligibility criteria? I think the feedback for those of you in the room and who saw the webinar really had to do with dates that seemed like they were in the past, which didn't allow developers a chance to move forward and meet criteria that they didn't necessarily know about ahead of time. Again, process timelines will have changed versus what was proposed last week, but there's still an understanding that this needs to move quickly. And so the input here that essentially says, or what we took as giving stakeholders a chance to react and respond to a set of rules, rather than putting them in place with no chance to kind of adjust or adapt to them, is the vast majority, so well over 90%. And we can talk about substantive changes versus not. It's obviously a subjective term, substantive, at least in this case. But the idea here, what we read into this was a clear desire to have an understanding of the rules and an ability to meet them before they're put in place. Okay. And then on the third question is, when should the CLR status be declared in the application? We'll call it 2-to-1 ratio, really expected or would prefer to see that right at the beginning. So as the large load interconnection comes in, it should be marked as a CLR. You'll note that the ratio is more like a 4 or a 5-to-1 in terms of the companies who are connecting, so the TDSPs. This one, I would say, is not a clear, a clear preference, but it's a strong preference toward actually requiring the applications to come in with the CLR if that's what the intent is. And then maybe we'll go through the free text response, and we can pause for a second. I think, as I said at the beginning of this section, really a lot of interest around how to get into the earlier batches. In particular, though, we had a question on bring your own generation. I will call out, we talk about CLR and BYOG kind of together as it's an activity that a developer or a project can undertake in coordination with others to kind of move the process forward faster. That's how we've heard it described, but we recognize that they're actually very different mechanisms. What we would say is what we heard here is partly that the identification early in the application period is going to be important. So the top bullet or bar here. We also saw, if you read the third one down, that there's real benefit. If you are, and this will come up later when we talk about, the studies here being transmission constrained and not RA studies, but there's real benefit to having projects come with their own generation. But there needs to be some binding commitments that go along with that to bring those benefits that come to the system. We'd also say that this then brings in a real challenge of if we've got generation and loads that are going through separate processes and not treated in some sort of coordinated manner, that you might lose that benefit. So we heard multiple times, generation and load projects might be linked financially. One can't go forward without the other. And so by having separate processes, you introduce more risk to that project being viable. So it needs to be considered together. How that's done, though, gets to be challenging in some cases. You'll see down the second to the bottom, there's not been a single answer across all different types of projects that seems to satisfy something on a technical level that would support, I think, the intent of a lot of the requests. And then you'll hear this thematically come up multiple times. New rules and a new set of criteria need to come into place, but on the very bottom you'll see there's a lot of concern that as you start to add administrative layers on, that it makes the process harder rather than faster and easier. And so the intent here, or the sense from what we heard across stakeholders, was that BYOG as a mechanism to improve the system and kind of grow ERCOT in a more reliable way exists, but finding the way to get there, and the devil's really in the details to make sure that actually lands correctly.
Very good. Thank you, Jesse. We'll pause for questions here. So Monica and then Gideon. Go ahead, Monica.
Hi, this is Monica from Vistra. So when I read all the eligibility criteria for bring your own generator, something which we saw missing was with regard to co-located load projects with existing generator. Mm-hmm. So one of the criteria that we had provided feedback on in the survey was this reference to this interaction of the batch study with timeline with the PURA 39.6169D net metering arrangement, 120 days statutory deadlines. So the extra review of this net metering arrangement that SB6 adds builds upon the existing ERCOT large load interaction process, and it's strictly time bound. So we're trying to understand how ERCOT is planning to reconcile that timeline, especially with regards to loads that have very advanced or have completed their large load interconnection process.
Christina Switzer, Senior Regulatory Counsel with ERCOT. I appreciate the question, and I think that is something we will have to consider as we go through this process.
Thank you.
All right. I think next up was Gideon, then Shannon. Go ahead.
Hello, Gideon Powell, President of the TBGA. On the CLR, Figure 134, and the BYOG, Bring Your Own Generation, we'd love to really see one clear path to simplify the administrative burden. And so really, with the CLR program having zero expectations of uptime and bringing their own generation, we just really want to continue to reiterate that Figure 134 combined with generation is absolutely what we see as best for the grandmas and other people that are concerned about reliability. So my son and I, we did some block walking, we did our own survey, and reliability and affordability continue to be the number one issue for a lot of the grandmas and grandpas that live around my son and I. So,
all right, thank you, Gideon. Shannon, a question and a comment on the prior slide. So the question I'd have here is on the when should CLR status be declared in the application, this, upfront or after allocation. To the degree that those are submitted up front and you're always treated that you'll get as much firm is available, and then what's left, you can opt to take the CLR piece of that, then getting it up front, I think is fine. But things that to think through is on the CLR piece of this, it makes a difference whether it's just an N-1 driven thing that's driving your CLR, or it's, which quite honestly could dang near bind on you every day in the summer type of thing. That's like a real high exposure. But in contrast, a G-1, N-1, or an auto -1, N-1, those are like orders of magnitude lower probability, maybe many orders of magnitude lower probability. So as the developer off-taker of that, your risk profile is quite different. And the latter, it's much easier for you to sign up for. The former, you better have your own best that you're going to try to put in right behind it, or something that you're not in a non-attainment zone or something. So just think about those to the developer. Those will be very different in the risk profile.
All right, thanks, Shannon. Rishi.
Good morning. Hope you can hear me. I put a link in the chat, folks, for just for socializing awareness, that in my public comments, I referred to this paper that both myself and I think Sai on the ERCOT side had been doing for a little bit on how we just revise the netting rules for co-located assets so that funds can telemeter gross megawatts for the gen and the load side. And while this concept was started, of course, is like us fixing the operations stuff so that it made more sense for folks to co-finance gen and load as a I would say, joined asset in operations. I guess maybe the question I have is two-part. From the survey responses, did anybody bring this up as a thing we could do efficiently to help with the colo proposal in the batch process? And if it has been moving around in ERCOT, do you all think that we might be able to yank it into the colo rules and get this work done by June?
Well, ERCOT is open to discussions of the CLRs and the co-located gen with the stakeholders over the next 60 days, correct? How that happens or what the rules of the road are, that's the devil in the details that we all have to get around as to what makes it feasible and doable in that timeline. So I appreciate the link to the document to help jumpstart people in that.
Yeah. I mentioned it because I'm thinking right now about how the stuff we've already done, whether it's the Figure 134 work that's happened or it's the colo netting concepts that have already been put out there. And we're happy to kind of sort of, power wash all of the stuff that we've done and give it to ERCOT staff to consider how to batch it into, it's the wrong word, how to group it into these accelerated timelines. So we're here to help with that stuff. And I want to make sure that I pointed out that this is in my public comments as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishi. All right, and then Talha.
Hey, this is Talha, and I'm from Apex Clean Energy.
If you can speak up a little bit, we can barely hear you, but go ahead.
Okay. I have a question on the, on the large load interconnection process. How do we know which batch our LL is going to be studied in? By what date would we know, as I see in the last presentation, we had scheduled for 3 batches, batch 1, batch 2, batch 3, and batch 1 is starting in January 27, for example. Then how soon would we know like our LL is going to be studied in? And does the COD impact batch consideration?
So I'm going to have to cut you off. Sorry. So that's not part of the discussion right now. I apologize. So if you want to put that question in your pocket and bring it out later, you can. Okay. So any other questions on the eligibility piece?
Okay. And the other question was like how we are linking the existing generation interconnection request with the load request if we have already the generator in queue. Would we be discuss that here?
We'll discuss it in the process. Right here, we're just getting clarity on the idea of CLR. Conceptually, if these are things that people want to continue and have interest in, not the how to get it done, if that helps.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're still, I would call it in the ideation phase this early in the project, and you're asking about the how and specifics, and we're not there right now.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the feedback. Evan and then Katie Coleman, and then we're going to cut it off at that point to move on. We can still ask questions at the end, but in the interest of time, So Evan, you go.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Evan Neal Lansing. We'll try to go quick. Just wanted to echo some of the comments that Shannon was making about when you make the declaration for CLR. I mean, I think we should consider that there's a lot of things that probably need to be considered in excess of what we do for the regular reliability studies now that's kind of envisioned for the batch process. I mean, I think back to the board meeting yesterday, or not yesterday, but a few days ago, where we were talking about the far West Texas IROL. That's really an off-peak, no solar, no wind scenario. And, if you're going to make the CLR declaration up front and assume a flexible interconnect in that study, it's virtually impossible to determine if you're going to create a new IROL that could be thermal N-1 binding, cascading, without looking at other snapshot dates that are not included in the current envisionment of the batch. And so I just want to be cautious that in order to do that reliably, we might need to be thinking additional studies, additional steps to take. And I want to remind everybody, that speed is of the essence. I know we did take a few times to slow down, but I think it was even mentioned in the commission meeting in Barksdale. Correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but I think it was intended for that to be a separate process as you guys have lined out. And we would want to make sure that we're not slowing down the process by adding more study burden in order to ensure reliability. So thanks.
Thank you for the comments. All right, and then Katie.
My question goes back to the BYOD issue. So under Figure 115 today, there is a provision that says that if a load is studied as part of a full interconnection study, that can suffice for the LLI study, but it's not clear how or if that's being implemented. And I'm wondering if somebody could give just a quick explanation of if you do have a co-located load and a new generator that gets submitted together, is ERCOT linking those at all today, or is that something that we're going to be creating anew in this process? And I know years ago the way you did it is you populated the private use network tab, but that now doesn't satisfy all the LLI criteria. So I'm just wondering if somebody could give a quick explanation of how and if you guys link co-located generation and LLIs today, so we can understand what needs to be resolved in the new NPRR on this.
Hey, Katie, this is A.G. Springer, ERCOT. So the paragraph you're referring to in Section 931 does allow for the full interconnection studies for generation to be also used as the large load interconnection studies, provided that it satisfies all the requirements detailed in Section 5.3, as well as the large load interconnection study requirements in Section 9.3 of the planning guide. To date, there has, to my knowledge, not been a study that has been submitted under that provision. The general approach that we have seen is that customers are electing to have both studies done separately for maximum flexibility between allowing the two phases, the two portions of the project, generation and large load, to proceed forward independently in case there are construction delays or other delays that might affect one piece of the project. The independent studies allow for both pieces to come online on their own timeline. I think, and I'll touch on these on my slides later, I think conceptually, if there was to be allowance for bring your own generation to potentially be treated differently or no impact to the grid in steady state studies, that we might need a more firm linkage there, but that's the current state of affairs today.
Thanks.
All right. And then Bill, and then we'll move on after your question.
Follow-up question on that, AG. So you said that you have not received any of those combined interconnection requests where there's a submission of a GINR with a load that also meets the criteria. I think maybe one of the reasons why that hasn't occurred is because you start in two different places at this point, with the GINR initiating at ERCOT and a large load interconnection request initiating with the TSP. So as someone that's doing that, how would we do that? So how would we submit a combined proposal to ERCOT under Planning Guide Section 5.3 where they are linked in the beginning?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I just want to clarify again, the intent is not to link the two interconnection requests with this paragraph. The intent was to allow for a path for the TSP to not have to do essentially the same set of studies twice. And your point to the question about the start points and the overall timing of the two interconnection process, I think that's something we can consider as we develop the batch.
Okay. We were very much interested in submitting what you just described, and we'd give us guidance on how to do that. So appreciate it.
Okay. So Shannon and Joelle, I'm going to have to put y'all in the queue for now, and we're going to need to move on to the Section C here. So keep your questions in your paper, and Jesse, you're clear to the next spot.
Cool. And there's actually just a little bit left on B because we had 2 free responses. Helpful maybe just to see. The real question here was batch 0A and 0B, do we like that, or do we want to do something that's a bigger batch 0? We did not see unanimous support for the proposal last time. I will say 2 to 1 majority. But what we heard in various comments was that the part of what is driving that was a lot of concern around whether or not folks would land in 0A. There's also a question on whether the design of the process had received enough stakeholder input. So we're beyond that now in terms of getting started with a proposal next Friday. But good for you all to see that there was feedback generally supportive, but far from unanimous. And then I think we would enter just the set of open comments around kind of eligibility criteria for the batches. I would summarize these as there's a real anchor on fairness. I realize fair is a pretty subjective term. That continues to be true, but it's really was around kind of what is a reasonable and fair outcome in terms of the batches and the eligibility to move projects forward. Also a desire to see that projects were real, non-speculative and likely to come forward if they were coming out. There's also an acknowledgement throughout these comments that's hard. Defining what it means as a written down criteria that's applicable and not kind of I know it when I see it turns out to be quite difficult, and so is part of the task of the next set of processes to bring into the batches. And I would say again, we heard, if you read the bottom, over and over frustration around the timelines and how quickly it felt like things were moving, and so we've moved past that. And so I would just say, continue to give feedback into the process. It is being heard in lots of forums and by lots of folks, and this sort of moves us forward into good information in the batch eligibility criteria, but also we'll be headed into a new process pretty quickly here. Okay, so maybe I'll jump into the beginning of C, where let me just make sure I actually have the survey up just so I get the answers right. But a real question here around the batch study itself. And so the question here that starts out is, should ERCOT centralize the responsibility for large load interconnection batch studies? And what we heard on the first 2 responses, the left and the right, is that absolutely ERCOT should be involved and the ERCOT should be leading the studies. The question that goes back and forth is whether or not the TSPs are kind of on the lead on the upgrade identification. There's still a few folks, not unanimous, but a few folks who prefer to work with the TSPs. You'll see the weighting is actually toward some of the large load customers without actually running through ERCOT coordination. I think I did. Okay. So we'll then go on to the next question here, which was really a question around frequency. And this is after batch 0. So once we hit there's too many, I want to say steady state, but that's also a buzzword here. But once we hit a kind of a cadence of batches, the question was, should these be run annually, semi-annually, or every 9 months, somewhere in between? What we heard was 6 months, so semi-annually from the responses. We have to contextualize that in that we've also heard in some of the stakeholder feedback that in and of itself may not be fast enough, but that getting it faster than that and reaching the desired level of reliability, the outcome, is going to be challenging, and that there's very little support for actually moving this out to an annual process. And we felt that the cadence of that was far too slow to support the speed and growth that the system's seeing. And so recognize, again, you had 3 radio buttons. There's a lot of free text and context for this question. But the idea aligned with kind of a batch 1, 2, 3, 4 running on a 6-month cadence had quite strong support. Pause there if there's any questions or comments on that.
Yeah, we'll just connect the dots as we're going through this. You'll find that everyone wants it to be every 6 months, but people are also hoping that we can do a restudy, and the two may not necessarily coincide. So restudy option may push us into the 9-month bucket, which nobody wants. But then not doing a restudy keeps us in the 6-month bucket, but people don't want to do it without a restudy. So just connecting the dots as we go through. So we'll keep going. And again, we'll then catch the batch study at the end of these questions. So proceed on.
Okay. There is a question here on methodology for the batch study. As Jeff described last time in Figure 127, the study is not an RA. It's not a resource adequacy study. It's a wire study or a transmission constraint study. And so the proposal and the wording that was written out there was to add generation to ensure that the binding constraint isn't resources. By and large, the agreement was that stakeholders would prefer to keep that. I think there were a couple of comments on whether or not the right signal was created to incentivize new generation. That was what we saw, at least in the free text of the 11% who said maybe do something else. There's also, I think the other piece of that was around bring your own generation, which will continue to be a theme throughout this about whether or not there's some piece of that should feed into here. But what we saw by and large was that these studies shouldn't be failing to allocate load because the generation's not sufficient. Okay. And then again, on a bit of a technical piece on the study process, the question was how should ERCOT incorporate dynamic stability analysis into the batch study? And the thing to read in a lot of these questions is there's a bit behind the question, and you see that the answers basically give you a screening first and run the full reliability later versus doing it all together. And the difference between these is actually also in the timeline. And so recognizing that doing the early screening may actually reduce the allocation, but it does it in a way that keeps the process moving forward at a faster cadence, I would say fairly strong to broad support to move in that direction. I think obviously on an individual project basis, people may have different views, but by and large, as the process is designed, there was quite strong agreement there. And then we have one that comes up quite a bit later also in the free comments, and so I'll do the voiceover, which is the question on these batch studies, what is the scope of the transmission upgrades that should be identified by the batch study process? And as laid out in the proposal last week, the batch study process would be able to do kind of something somewhere between limited and expanded upgrades, but would not be creating new rights of way. And then the question here was, do you maintain the very limited scope, so think of it as substation upgrades or something in that line, rather than actually expanding it to something that would be more substantive, complex improvements included? The survey questions themselves give a little more detail on what that might look like. And then the other question is, do we actually need to include any and every upgrade that would be needed to serve the full load, which will link to things like RTP and RPG, as well as what the wires companies themselves are able to get into place. And what we heard by and large is, yes, we would expect that the upgrades which can be identified in a faster pace, you'll see that the other piece here is that if you get to the bigger studies that include sort of greenfield rights of way, that identification is going to push out the timeline of the study. The preference among stakeholders was to maintain that 6 months with, I think, the expectation again, linking the stakeholder interviews with the expectation that many loads, if not most loads, would be able to be served with upgrades that don't require large-scale greenfield expansion. You will note, though, that when we look at the weighting, it's 1 in 5, sat in that far right box, but it's closer to 1 in 2 of the TDSPs who actually felt that a broader set of identification might be helpful. And so I would say there's a lot of nuance in this, and I think further commentary and discussion is probably warranted as the process moves forward. But by and large, at least an expectation that most loads could connect inside this batch process with a reasonable set of upgrades was what we think sits behind that desire to again, continue to move quickly and hit that 6-month cadence. And then I will wrap up on the comments. And again, you have all these materials, you'll be able to go back through them. The biggest points here is, there is a need to integrate the RTP and the RPG process. I think both from identification of upgrades, but what we heard again and again going back to December is what comes out of the batch needs to be something that actually creates assurance that notice to energization is going to be there. So essentially what looks like a reservation. And so a lack of linkage or not too tight of an interlinkage between the RTP, RPG, and batch process could create risk, which makes projects harder to move forward. That links to, you will see as you go down to the fourth one, this idea that timely and stable results are incredibly important to come out of the process. There were plenty of comments also here, again, about how do we think about BYOG controllable loads. And then finally, once again, whether or not loads are real, projects are real, or if they're speculative pieces. So all of that, though, culminates in the bottom line, which says, we really do need ERCOT, though, to lead on this and put forward a revision request that ties all this together. Again, recognizing that there are quite a few competing priorities and that not everything can land all together at once in June. I think this is probably a good place to stop and hear further comments on the batch process.
Okay, so this is weird. So I do want to take questions on the batch process. When we transitioned to that, at that point, there was 4 people in the queue, Shannon, Joelle, Clayton, and Sam. Are any of your questions on the batch study, or is it going back to the other one?
Mine are.
Yours are on the batch process? Okay, we'll work the queue, but if it's on eligibility, I'm going to still punt it back to the end of the line. So does that make sense? So sorry, I'm going to work the queue as is, but again, it's for the batch study only questions right now. So first up is Shannon.
All right, so I had one that was left over in the last session.
For later, yes.
All right. Let's go to slide 13. I want to kind of further emphasize something Bill was emphasizing.
It's on eligibility. We're on batch process.
I had some on that, but you told me a while ago that I needed to hold these.
You need to hold the question until we get to the end of all the other discussions on B, C,
Fine.
D, E, F, G. Yes, sir. So we're on the batch process theme.
Actually, I'd encourage you, Matt, to think about this behind-the-meter generation piece, or bring your own gen.
Yes.
My comment on that.
Yes.
This is super important. You heard that feedback.
It is.
My comment on that is AG talked about how a lot of people asked for those two to be processed separately. I understand that.
Yes.
But we should understand that some people have firm gas, and there's no grid capacity for the summer, the steady state set of studies, and you want to bring these two,
Yes.
and they can come quickly. Y'all's process really should make that available.
It is very important, and we could spend another hour on it. And so, again, I'm just trying to run the meeting.
On that. 21 then, go to slide 21.
You bet.
On this piece right here, I think it's so important for ERCOT to collaborate with the TSPs through your batch process on the upgrades that are achievable and not. Because from TSP to TSP, it may be a very different answer. And at the end of the day, it's that TSP that's going to be doing it. So I would encourage good, strong dialogue through your steady state study. Last thing's on 22. It's the second item there. Need to tightly integrate batch studies with RTP, RPG. Right now, the flow chart y'all have laid out last meeting has the RPG, RTP essentially following the batch. Something to think about for the ultra mature projects. Given the PUC guidance that came out last Friday and some of the things Encore sent out yesterday, for really mature projects, it's very possible they will be in this RTP that's about to occur, and you will actually know the set of upgrades coming out of the back end of that RTP. I would encourage ERCOT to think about those much like you laid out in your presentation last week ago Tuesday, where things that have already been RTP or RPG approved go in as firm, and that allows those very mature projects to actually effectively go in the reverse. You've worked through the RTP faster if you can meet all of their requirements than waiting to get in batch one later on, if that makes sense.
All right, thanks, Shannon. So again, I'll ask Joelle this next in the queue. Joelle, this would be for the batch study part of the meeting.
Sure. Even though, just a very, very quick question on the before. So Shannon touched on it. So is gas going to be considered separately or no, or that's still under discussion?
Is what going to be considered separately? Sorry.
So let's say if a load is coming online or proposing to come online with a gas generation rather than, let's say, no generation at all or any other renewable, is that going to be considered differently?
Is the co-location type piece?
Yes, but also the type of generation also.
This is A.G. Springer. Several of the questions that are coming up right now are going to be, ERCOT does have in the next slide deck some feedback on where we stand on some of these questions, especially around co-location and inclusion and treatment of CLRs. And so if we could maybe hold those questions, I think my presentation will address several of them.
Understood. Thank you. My other question on the batch. So there was a discussion, and even before that, ERCOT will not, let's say, identify big upgrades, let's say, that include right-of-ways or any of that. It's even on the slide on 22. So my question is, how would that be taken into account? Or like, what would the result be? An allocation of 0 for such loads that need such big upgrades? How is ERCOT treating that?
I think that's still to be determined. I think that will be a subject of discussion at the subsequent workshops. I think really the crux of this question is related to how long is the batch process and what's the cadence, because that has impact on the scope of what can be evaluated within that time. So I think those two topics will be discussed further.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Clayton.
Yeah, mine's back on 21. It's kind of along the lines of where Shannon was going. I would say that the project determination is not just TSP to TSP. It's also project to project. Upgrading a 10-mile, 138 kV line, yeah, you could probably do that. A 50-mile, 345, you're probably not going to do that, even though the studies tell you can. So in some of these cases, we are going to have to find new lines, new paths, new rights of way. And I think that foreclosing on those options, just because they're difficult, is not reasonable. And I think that, we're going to see the presentation next week. I think some of this stuff can be done programmatically, at least to give us ideas of what lines can be accomplished quickly and what other projects can be accomplished quickly that are much more efficient or more doable than some of these other things. If we're going to wind up with, 200 line upgrades, I think that, we're in fantasy land at that point. You can accomplish that, but it's going to take you 20 years. So, and kind of the larger view here too is that I think there's a post-processing piece that may be missing in your current plan, where you actually are working with the TSP to try to determine what's feasible. And some of that, I think, needs to feed into the studies before you even go in, so that these projects are not even recommended. If it's something that can't be done, leave it out.
All right, very good. Sam, go ahead.
All right. It's more of a comment than a question, but I can't help but to think that I think a lot of these responses are driven by, like the entity's own agenda, as in what would benefit me the most. So I think while these responses and understanding these feedback is important. I think, but at the end of the day, ERCOT should make an informed decision on what would be the best for the system, not necessarily what is like the most popular options. Like, for example, what Clayton said, like these upgrades that are, just straightforward upgrades will take forever. There will be 200 of them. But if you want to, scope out the full upgrades, like greenfield projects, it'll, obviously the studies will take longer. And the process will drag on. So, I think, just a point there that, ERCOT I would hope that ERCOT makes like an informed decision on what the best option would be, not necessarily the most popular.
You bet. Thanks for that, Sam. All right, Chris Mattos.
Chris Mattos, Google. I think it really comes as no shock. You're going to hear from stakeholders that would like things tomorrow, and with all the 765s designed for them. So the slide to me is helpful, but we don't have an understanding of the trade-offs and timelines in sort of any different context. I think in our proposal, right, we lay out at least a one revisit of a restudy and loads to opt-in or out that align with firm financial commitments with it. And so there is some way, I think, to do at least identify a majority of the upgrades needed in a prospective timeline that can then roll into a broader RTP process that maybe identifies the actual right-of-ways and other finishing details to those transmission projects. So I hesitate to put these things into these neatly buckets as a survey has put, because Google's preference is going to be more assurance on the actual infrastructure build that comes out of it than what the 6-month process currently offers. And that really is largely based on our current experiences with the RPG process and the delays that have resulted in the approval of transmission projects there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Bharat.
Hey, Bharat Rahulpati, Crusoe. So my question is extension to what Shannon asked about the inclusion in 26 RTP versus batch study. I know there is a slide later. If you want me to wait, I can ask the question later, but I wanted to understand the correlation between those two and how are you treating loads that may not be in RTP but want to continue in batch because of the criteria.
Yeah, I think the quick answer on that is we don't know yet. I think we need to, we're thinking through the feedback, and when we roll out the revision request, we'll have that included. We don't know today, though.
Okay, because there are deadlines to be included, so we just want to clearly understand the path forward.
Yep,
thanks.
Got it.
All right, thank you. On to Kevin Hansen.
Yeah, Kevin Hansen and Energy. I'm just curious, does ERCOT currently have the staff needed to support the batch process and the potential follow-up dynamic studies? If not, does ERCOT need to wait for the NPRR to be approved prior to adding on the additional staff needed?
AG will take your resume and review it if that's if you're looking for a job, Kevin.
AG knows me, and that's not a good thing, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's TBD, but I will say that this is a high priority for ERCOT, and so we will make staff available to make this happen.
All right, Prashant? Prashant, there you are. Go ahead.
A quick clarification on the RTP loads. So are all the RTP loads approved or gone through the load studies? If not, how would ERCOT basically differentiate them for inclusion in the batch? That's the question.
You cut out a little bit. Can you just say it one more time? Did you catch it?
So all the loads submitted into RTP, would they have actually gone through all the load studies and got approved, or if not, how would ERCOT differentiate when they are basically selecting some of the RTP loads to be included in the batch?
Yes, the question is, have all the large loads that are included in the RTP, if they've gone through the current study process? I'm not sure that they have. Actually, I don't think that they have. But I think treatment for those in the batch study going forward or in the RTP going, in the RTP, it'll be based on the 58480 rule that the commission just adopted. I think for batch studies, I think that's a little bit TBD.
All right. And the queue is clear. Let's celebrate the moment. Thank you. Jesse, on to you, sir.
Yeah, and then we've got, I think, 10 questions left, so we're 2/3 of the way through the survey. Maybe it's a good point to just reemphasize what I think Sam and Chris said, which is this is not meant to be survey run through an ML algorithm and design the process. We're wanting to feedback to you the feedback that you gave ERCOT, but also some of these there's very clear alignment and an understanding of why, and in other cases I wouldn't call it noise, but there is a different set of opinions from stakeholders, and ERCOT's going to take that all into account and design with a human touch, not just a output of a survey. But we do think it's important to go through this. So jumping on to the allocate and commit section, and as a reminder, this is once the batch study is done, there is a decision to be made about how to allocate the load that's available to connect, and then what the timeline and the requirements are for large load customers to commit to that. So the first question that we asked was really, what's the decision window? Once the batch study is closed and once you know what your allocation is, how long should the customers of the large loads have to make that decision or make that commitment, which is likely going to come with some requirements? What I would say as a preface to this, and we heard over and over again, is we assume that folks answering this question did this with the intent and understanding that the date that was communicated would be known well in advance. So if we have a March 1 batch announcement, you would have expected to have known weeks to even maybe a month or two ahead that was coming. And so the question is, if you want it shorter, and which then obviously means that the internal processes of the stakeholders need to move more quickly, or longer, which then means that the process needs to be pushed out because the next batch can't be run until you know what the firm loads that sit inside of it. And we obviously, this one actually looks like a distribution, but a clear spike around 30 days. We did hear in plenty of interviews when we had longer discussions that it was going to be quite difficult for some organizations to make that commitment, even in under 90 days. And so I think part of that is with the view of, what does the process take internally versus from when I know, if I've been working ahead of that, what's the duration. But you see here that the idea of a 30-day window that gives you enough time to respond but doesn't then push the batches out potentially an extra month or two seems to be consensus. But this one I assume will be up for further discussion as we go forward and not be set here, but it's good for you all to, I think, see this distribution. Okay. And then there was a much, I don't want to say philosophical, but a higher level question about whether or not folks agreed with the intent of the batch process and the allocation. As stated in the presentation last week, the intent was to maximize the load served on the system. And you can think of that as treating loads once they're in the batch process as having cleared hurdles, that they're considered sort of real, and the expectation is that the dates and the energization is possible. And so we got sort of a 4-to-1 ratio of folks saying, yes, I think the ERCOT system should be serving as much load as possible without making further judgments. Some of the disagreement that we heard, because there was some free text that went along with question 24 here, was really around what that allocation should be. Some of it had to do with further judgment of whether or not the load was real once it had been through the batch process. And then in other cases, there's a concern that no matter how you set up the allocation process, some of the inputs, whether it's your size or date timing, could be used to game the allocation on the back end. And whether it's the TDSPs or the large load customers or the generators and other, there still continues to be a desire to try to make this as clear and straightforward a process, one where you're not sort of playing game theory with all the other participants. And so at least the noise we heard or the constraint then on that 19% was less of we don't think that's what ERCOT should be doing, but we expect ERCOT to be pretty careful with how it's done. Okay. And then there is, I think, probably the trickiest question, and I'll try not to stumble too much through this, and Jeff and AG and Matt are here to correct me if I get this one wrong. But this starts to get into the details of the CLR process. And so the question is here, if you've got a CLR load that's in the batch, And obviously, most of these large loads have ramp schedules. As you go through the ramp schedule and as you go through the years out to full energization, if you see inside the modeling that the load wouldn't be bound, so would be able to meet the full firm in 1 year versus others, in this middle bucket, should that full megawatt allocation be given in the years where you can meet it, and then maintain the CLR relationship in the other years? So you can imagine a situation where a load over time comes in and out of CLR status. Or should, on the left side, should in all cases that CLR status be maintained where the firm load is given at the minimum request or at the CLR allocation? And then only then later on could you kind of pull out of the CLR qualification or status. The final one was to say, look, in the allocation process, we actually don't think that the CLR status should have any impact whatsoever, and should be kind of kept out of the numbers. Struggle a bit to think of exactly the scenario where that's beneficial to anyone to maintain that. But what we saw, at least from our reading of the question and what we believe people read the question, was that if the system isn't binding and constrained in a year where that load could be fully met, that actually should be granted. Whereas in other times, that CLR would come into play to maintain kind of the connection. We've got a few more questions in this section. I'm sure we'll come up or a few more questions to cover, and then we'll have questions at the end. Number 4, it really, again, BYOG, we talked about it quite a bit, but what was laid out in the presentation last Tuesday on slides 40 and 41, you'll be able to reference that, was a question here of whether or not everyone can agree with that set of it says rules here, but really it was a set of principles for how to think about and categorize those. I think by and large, again, 4-to-1 ratio, we saw that folks generally said that they would agree with that. We did hear a lot of free text comments, and I imagine, Matt, over the next few months that BYOG and CLR are going to be their own sort of mega topics for how to work through the process. But real questions on how and why and where to study these things together. One note that we did hear specific to what was written in the description in the presentation last week was around storage and how storage is treated in the system, as it sort of relates to whether gas and firm generation versus something with an energy limited characteristic. But by and large, we did hear the layout and the structure was something that folks could get behind. And then we'll go through the last two here and stop for questions. The fifth question in the allocate and commit section was around milestones. And so the expectation is there'll be an allocation that comes out of the batch process. There'll be a commitment period where folks will join that. And then that load has a ramp schedule that is sort of communicated to the TSPs in ERCOT. And if we see a miss of milestones, and those milestones still need to be well-defined, that looks like essentially that load is not going to be energized in the timeline that had been promised. And the implication here is that we have loads that are taking up a slot on the system, but they're kind of boxing out or they're preventing other loads from connecting. How to manage that? And so, no clear answer across these. And by the way, this was a tick multiple. But, a third of folks said, we maybe should start to think about reallocating that capacity. Not the day that they missed, but there's some period after which, at some point, if you're not using it, it should go back into the system and no longer be something that you can claim. The second most popular response was actually just to kick the project out entirely. You'll see that got the least votes from the folks who were actually trying to connect. So we can kind of read a bit into that. And then there's something around, do you just start to essentially charge money to hold the slot? This isn't a free option that you can keep forever. Maybe you put a cost against it. And you'll see the other bucket is not immaterial. There were, you can see some of the comments here, but points around there's ways to design a system that both incentivizes folks to connect faster and also creates a feedback loop that should reduce the amount of speculation going forward. If you have a free option once you've been allocated, it certainly reduces the impetus to sort of be more realistic in your estimates. And so there is an agreement, though, across all of these that a commitment and an allocation should lead to energization, and it shouldn't lead to kind of a stub or a slot that can just sit indefinitely in the system. So then finally, we've got the free text comments. What we heard, particularly on this allocate and commit, that there's clear sort of negative system-wide or negative externality impacts of speculative load, whether it's jamming up the process at the front end or loads that land at the end where there's a potential that, once the commit comes, if they're not ready, they drop out, which can introduce all sorts of issues. We'll talk about restudies later. We also heard that the CLR portion of this continues to be an important piece. So if I summarize these, I'd say, one, this will be a very technical specific point, but it's important. What we heard was there was strong feedback that if there is loads that drop out, so they do not commit once they've been allocated capacity, that there's a strong desire to put that capacity back into the same batch. And there's obviously a technical question about how do you do that in an expedient manner, but rather than sort of kick it to the next batch. And we also heard, again, deter speculation and make sure we're looking at things that are credible when we're doing the allocation. And that if you read from the second from the bottom, CLR, bring your own generation, flexible loads, all of that really should be thought of in terms of a net impact to the grid when the allocation comes through and not treated entirely separately. So maybe that's a good place to pause. I would imagine we have a question or two.
Yeah, I got 3 in the queue here. Clayton, go ahead.
Yeah, on the posting your financial security piece, the grace period in there, we were not big fans of long, extended time grace periods, especially since it's located at the end of the process. Really what you should be getting is like an up or down on the load ramp, the revised load ramp that you received. You're probably getting something that's a little modified. It may be a little cost. It's going to be like $20 to $50 million. So it seems like a fairly easy decision at that point. So I don't think you need a lot of time. The critical piece here is we've got to get it quick because this is where a lot of the batch processes across the U.S. are failing. And people get their request, they don't want to continue on, and then that's what spurs these restudy issues. I think that we're going to have the ability to do restudies or find other ways to back them out fairly quickly. And there's always, the need right now is infinite. So at least in the start of this process, I don't think we need to worry about, overbuilding. I don't think there's going to be the possibility of overbuilding right now, at least for the near term. So anyway, I think that is a critical piece, and I think that we need to keep that short.
Very good. Next up is Eric.
There was the slide about should we maximize the load, and I think that this question might have been, inadequate to get to the question because I think people might focus on the desire to maximize the amount of load without necessarily understanding what the proposed load allocation is and just focus on the clause maximize. So it might be just worth considering that as we look at the giant numbers. People like the word maximize.
Thanks, Eric. Next is Gideon. I'm sorry, Chris Mattos and then Gideon.
Chris Mattos, Google. On this slide, I think, again, I go back to the idea it's not really about maximizing load. It's about properly planning for load that is committed to interconnection and developing that transmission. I understand there is a short-term desire to allocate and parse up what's left of the existing system, but I think we are increasingly understanding that there may not be much there. And so starting the process of getting to that future state grid, I think, is the bigger priority and harmonizing interconnection with transmission planning. And then on slide 26, is this the one? No, I think it may have been on allocation again, so maybe I have the wrong slide number. There was a comment about sort of maybe making them pay for capacity that's underutilized or something for reallocation. Yes, thank you. 27. I think this is going to be part of 58481's discussion at the commission, and Google's position has been, at the very least, some sort of minimum transmission charge may already get incorporated to penalize or create some of that cost into it so that it doesn't go underutilized, but also all of the framework around any reallocation of load should offer certain protections to the load based on the fact that, frankly, supply chains are a little bit unpredictable, and we've all experienced that both on the gen side, the load side, and the transmission side. So something I think this will be more informed in the commission than it will be by ERCOT.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. Gideon, and then Clayton.
My question is on support alternative allocation objectives, but prioritize reliability and firm load first. That sounds very discriminatory towards loads that are non-firm that will best support ERCOT customers and residentials. So I'd really like to understand, and maybe I'm wrong, please tell me if I'm wrong, when it says prioritize reliability, is that reliability of residential customers?
I think it's just a question of how people read the question. I don't know if there's anyone?
Yeah, I answered it as president of the TBGA, and so, it makes me sad to see that we're going to layer in non-firm or CLR where system headroom is demonstrated. I just don't like seeing firm load prioritized. So I think this non-firm load's a game changer, and I'd really like to roll up my sleeves and work with everybody to make that a reality.
I don't think anything that you've heard today dissuades us from pursuing CLR as rapidly as possible in the context of this. So, but you've made your statement. I don't disagree with that way of interpreting it. So, all right, Clayton.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, if somebody fails a batch, are we anticipating putting in like a lockout period?
What's failing a batch? Bowing out, or
bowing out?
They don't show up
you
a
don't
year?
Post your. You get your results. You don't post your security. You say, I'm not going to participate. You can't stay in the next batch with that same load, right? We need to clear you out and get to the next set of loads, right?
That's a question we've had internally, whether or not there's a suspension from the next wave or something like that.
Four.
Yeah, we're open to that one. So we'll just consider that a market design thing as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Next one. Next question is Melissa.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to go back to the duration about how long a company has after they get the results. I don't remember what slide that is on, but I wanted to offer just a different perspective than what Clayton laid out. I think, having a quick timeline, you have to have somewhat of a quick timeline, but something like 14 days or 30 days doesn't work for a lot of companies. When you're getting results back that say, hey, this might be 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, depending on the upgrade, and it might cost you X million, you have to take that back to the various business units. It can really change their planning if it was something that they needed to start in 2 years, but now it can't come online for 7. So, we want to work with everyone to find the right timeline, but something really short's not doable, especially when you have multiple projects.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, Barksdale.
Thanks. I just want to respond to that comment, Melissa, and also to Clayton's previous comment. I think both of those issues are also part of our rulemaking in 58481, and so making sure that we are aligned with what folks in the room and online are interested in and what makes sense for ERCOT, we need to make sure that those are lining up in the rulemaking. So any kind of discussion about consequences for let me start that sentence over again. Any discussion about decision-making after a batch is done and the consequences for not moving forward after the batch is done, we really need to make sure that that gets nailed in the rule. Thanks.
And I think ERCOT, we may develop a slide just so people know what 58481 is, what it is, and what it's not. And that may help just as a quick reference so everyone doesn't have to be an expert, me included. So, all right, next one. Prashant and then Monica. Go ahead, Prashant.
Yeah, so the ramp schedules that we typically submit, the developers submit, or just forecast. Forecast cannot be 100% accurate all the time. There could be a lot of issues that could delay the forecast, like the supply chains, construction, and all that stuff. And when we submit this ramp schedule, we either submit like quarterly, monthly, or however the TSP asks us. So instead of just maybe one comment there is to use year-end forecast rather than monthly or quarterly when you are basically applying these penalties. year. So just use the year-end forecast. For example, if a developer says by the end of year, I have 300 megawatt, whereas the ramp schedule says by March, 30 megawatt, by April, 200 megawatt. So instead of going by month or quarterly, I think it would be useful to use just the year-end forecast.
All right, thank you. Yeah, feedback on the granularity of the ramp. Okay, thank you. So Monica and then Bill, and then let's try to move on if we can. Go ahead, Monica.
Quick clarifying question on your response to Gideon's firm load question or comment. Is your intent to reprioritize firm versus flexible loads after the development of your CLR BYOG rules?
No. We're trying to study everything accurately. So I think we're trying to figure out how do we hit a batch zero or in subsequent batches that say, and how do we consider CLRs clearly, and how do we consider cogen clearly in the context of that study?
Okay.
Without prioritization, it's the physics of what they're offering and the flexibility of what they're offering that allow.
Okay, so I guess you're not committed to prioritizing firm loads just depending on the context of the situation?
Yeah, I don't know where that phrase came from.
Yeah. It's in the feedback slide for the open comments.
Well, then it's feedback. Is it ERCOT words? That's what I'm trying to get. Feedback may not be us, so that's what I'm trying to.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry for the confusion. All right, and then Bill.
I believe this to be true, but making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of this concept. But you're hearing a lot about providing the commitment to move forward or making sure that the project is moving forward before this happens or before transmission capacity is reallocated. The timing of that and what that means, I think, is meeting the criteria in Project 58481 and being sure that the moving forward means providing all the required disclosures and commitments to construct the interconnection facilities. The energization of the actual data center or generation, that timing can vary. Like, for example, I see scenarios where we will have a combined cycle or gas plant built, and we may be waiting a year or two before the data center fully energizes. So when we talk about commitment to move forward, or are they moving forward, it is not when electrons start to be consumed from the grid or provided to the grid. It's when you've met all the conditions to have the interconnection facilities constructed, financial commitments met. You're building the pipe. What's flowing through the pipe may come later. I believe that to be true, but if anyone has a different understanding, I would like to hear it.
Yeah. Barksdale?
So I think that's part of the conversation that's happening in Project 58481. I think the way staff envisioned it in its second discussion draft that was filed in early January has the commitment coming out of the batch study process to be basically your ante at the poker table to be able to play the next hand. And so the next hand here being the construction, starting the construction phase of, let me make sure I'm saying that right. I don't think it's the construction phase. I think it's moving into the RPG process. Is that right? Coming out of batch?
Yeah, I'll say the way that I've been thinking about it is that after the batch study, it is you are meeting the interconnection agreement requirements from 58481, which tells us that you have met your financial security and you are moving forward with that project.
Right. It is not, I think the details about what that next step are, I think we're still discussing.
Yes.
But to Bill's point, it is not about you put the money down, the electrons start flowing the next day.
Correct.
Appreciate that clarity.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Ray, go ahead, Ray.
Ray Fakhoury, Amazon Web Services. Just a quick question for clarification from our side. Where in the process is the ability to kind of have the gating criteria for what goes into the batches to ensure that you're not getting duplicative or speculative projects. Is that being considered? And just something to clarify.
Yeah, I think that was falling under the theme of criteria. What criteria need to be met to get into that piece? So, yes.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. Q. Okay, and Katie had a comment about the firm versus subject to being more in terms of maturity rather than firm versus flexible. Thank you for that point of view, Katie. All right, so we're on D. Sorry, real quick. I had said we're not taking lunch, and it was in my email. I don't think I stated it, but we plan to end at 1 o'clock today. So on we go. Thank you.
All right, marching forward. The next couple of questions are about the integration of the large load process with the RPG. And the just very direct question here was, do you agree with the proposed regional planning group review process alignment with the batch study process as laid out last week in slide 44 of the workshop presentation? 3-to-1 ratio, we got strong agreement. I would say what's helpful with questions like this is the feedback and the kind of, we propose modifications. I think what we heard was partly around concern about complexity. That if you don't interlink the processes in a smooth way, what it'll do is it'll actually just delay each one separately, and you'll end up with a slowdown and a delay in outcomes from the batch process. And then I think there was, again, just more of a push around transparency and process standardization across the network. Okay. And then I would say closest question to parity, or sort of not a clear answer, but there's a lot to read into here, was really how should the large load interconnection request load commissioning plans be linked to transmission upgrade projects? I expect this will be the subject of a lot of discussions going forward. So I'm reading the feedback back to you. But the two things we basically laid out here were a project should either be directly linked to an interconnection for a large load should be directly linked to the transmission project that supports it, or should the outcome of the batch study, which gives an energization date or target, not be linked to a specific project, but essentially create a buffer or create enough room in the system that the expectation is that large load will connect, and then does not have to look at the supply chain delay for a specific breaker that may push a project back and sort of line up that way. What you'll see here is TDSPs, it was kind of 50-50 split of we'd rather just have the data, or we want to know the project. Very clearly, what we heard from kind of a risk and reliability standpoint is if there's a project that is being built to connect a load, that project needs to be built to connect that load. There's a lot of discussion. I don't think I will have all the nuance of exactly how this will run through all the processes, but Matt, Jeff, AG, you can probably get into it if we have questions. But wanted to give you the feedback that we heard here, both across the broader stakeholder groups as well as the clarity from the wires companies who responded. Okay. And then maybe we talk about the open comments in Section E, which is really around kind of what would you all like to share about RPG as it relates to the batch load process. So this speed comment on the beginning, the feedback here, and there were a lot of comments that supported this, really were about planning approval pathways. How do we get to loads that can connect and the existing headroom in the system, in addition to projects that can be built quickly to accelerate? There is if you look at the second from the bottom, another point again, and we saw this multiple times in the free comments around greenfield projects, and what needs to be identified when in the process. And so this links to the previous question on the batch study on what the upgrades look like. But that outcome about whether or not projects are actually able to support the load that's requested, whether it's larger upgrades, is important. And there is, if you read the bottom, again, every one of these questions comes back up in some way to CLR and BYOG. As you'll see, that is one of the vectors or one of the approaches that we think potentially enables loads to connect faster when there's been a lot of frustration in timing and transparency up to this point. It's maybe a good place to pause.
Yeah, thank you. We have 4 in the queue. Clayton.
Yeah, I think the responses here are somewhat dependent on the responses that we had earlier. where the assumption is that ERCOT's only going to do projects that are upgrade type projects in the batch study process, and then use the RPG for the additional work that needs to be done. If you have that kind of setup, sure, that's the way it's got to go. I don't think that works, though. I think what we need to be running is a batch study that basically is the RPG process. There is some sort of review in there in the post-processing, and the TSPs get their feedback in to make sure that what's being proposed, because the batch study process should be a complete RTP case type study. I mean, we should have a complete set of answers for all the load in the system at that point in time. I don't know how we get better answers from the RPG unless that is specific to each project and the feasibility of each project that is assumed in that process. So I am all for a review of results type process, but a full RPG where they go in and they perform a whole bunch of new studies whenever we've just had a conclusive study performed, I don't know that that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think we've heard a lot of feedback on this, and we have in-house, we've gone back and done a lot of drawing on the whiteboard and scribbling and drawing some more. I think we don't have a lot to share today on this, but we are we'll have something at the workshop on the 26th. So, but heard the feedback, understand what the concerns are, but don't have a lot of response on that today.
Thank you. So Eric, and then Cameron will be next. Go ahead, Eric.
Number one, I strongly agree with what Clayton said, but I want to add to it briefly, which is I think as both ERCOT staff and stakeholders, there's a lot of focus on what is the technical definition of an RTP, an RPG, and a batch. And I think we need to get out of that and say our goal is to create a transmission plan, and it doesn't matter the technical terms that we use to describe that. And to the extent that there are like certain NERC criteria that drive those decision makings, I think we need to set that aside if necessary to accomplish the goal of serving load, and then just make sure that we have some additional process to meet whatever checkbox criteria we have. And so to that end, I think it'd be really useful at that next workshop to talk about what all the different transmission planning processes are and how they might overlap or not, and how we can use them to accomplish our objective.
Thank you, Eric. Cameron.
Good morning, y'all. Cameron with the Data Center Coalition. Question and comment on the CLR process. When we're thinking about it, if CLR is going to be a way to expedite the process, does it end up becoming the only way to get interconnected, and then everyone else who isn't doing a CLR, are they now at the bottom of the list? On the same point, if you are going to say, hey, I'll do the CLR process, where's that accountability that you're actually going to do that? And so just being mindful of that process. I don't have a position here today, but just thinking through it and what those pieces would look like.
And AG's going to hit that in about 6 slides.
Okay, I got ahead of it. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Cameron. Shannon. I'm sorry, hold on. Shannon Caraway, yes. You're next.
I go back to slide 30. You know, you touched on this earlier when you said overwhelmingly, it almost looks like unanimously, all TSP comments, you know, their feedback is over in the group that the load commissioning plan should be linked with the transmission upgrades. Having once been one of them myself, I can understand why they would want that. Something I said earlier on an earlier comment, though, of if your batch process is one where you're very closely working with the TSPs while you're going through what is a reasonable upgrade so that they've had a chance to weigh in on that through the batch, I think their reluctance on the back end to feel like they're blindsided will be dramatically less. because they were a collaborative part of helping you believe, yes, we can do that. So that'd be first comment. Next slide on 31. Back to your very top item here, speed to market for transmission projects. You know, at the end of the day, the RTP and RPG are really the only places we're going to go secure new greenfield anything, you know, because that's where you got to go get. You're not going to get that in the batch. So to get a CCN, to get new right of way, and for these long lead time big projects, the only way to make those happen is going to be through that, because in the batch, you're intentionally, it looks like, going to exclude them, and will need to for practical reasons. So I think this is an area that ties back to my comment a moment ago. With the commission rule last Friday and this coming RTP that's about to occur, the loads that are very mature can get into that. They will be a part of enabling this new greenfield infrastructure by the end of the year that'll be approved. We need to have that, definitely needs to link into this first batch, because those that go in now, put up all the money, they've bought all the property and everything else, they should be firm going into that batch, because they will have helped justify this transmission with a real high bar.
Thanks, Shannon. Angela and then Haynes, and then we're going to need to move on. So last two.
Hey, Angela Chen from Satoshi Energy. Just want to make a quick comment that strongly agree with what Eric's point just now, that stakeholders would appreciate parsing out RTP versus RPG versus the batch and criteria for inclusion. And we agree that batch results should be constructible, and the goal is to approve loads in a realistic way for transmission planning. To Crusoe's point earlier, we just want to add to that and caution from just using the 2026 RTP inclusion as a sole criterion for batch zero inclusion. There are many loads that don't have any transmission upgrades that never go through this RPG process, and shouldn't disqualify these projects just for not being a part of this plan, while understanding, yes, the overarching goal is, of course, making sure that these loads that we want to energize soon have a constructible and viable plan moving forward. So I guess my question is this something along the lines of what ERCOT is currently considering?
Yeah, I'd say, again, we're still considering all of the feedback that we received, and we'll communicate that when we have the next workshop.
All right. And then last one, Haynes, go ahead.
Haynes Strader, Skybox. A similar question, but I'll try to make it a little more concise. So I think it's super important that whether it's through an RTP that the TDSP is running or not, you shouldn't be penalized for locating in a region or an area that doesn't have significant transmission upgrades required. And I think making sure that's either done simultaneously or it's included in the RTP process by the submitting TDSP, we need to come to some finality on. I would argue it shouldn't be the stakeholder saying there's no transmission upgrades required. It should be the TDSP that's giving that guidance, and they probably have a pretty good feel of how to rank those projects and prioritize them.
All right. Thank you, Haynes. All right. Back to you, Jesse.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So F was a free text question around financial commitments related to the process. I think we even prefaced the question with, this is largely going to be the PUC's domain. I would propose we not have sort of a discussion or debate on that here, and we skip to the next and just assume that gets taken care of. Although the comments
flash it on the screen to show your homework, but yes, I agree that we should not reopen all the ideas on financial commitment issues.
But this is available. This is public. This has been pulled in. But maybe we don't have the discussion now on it, and we skip to section G, where we've just got a couple of questions here on the communications. And there's two free text questions on this. There's a lot behind it. I think what will come out is part of the process, but is not necessarily a discrete process discussion. The two questions really are, what's the type of information? So this slide gives you a list of things that we heard would be important to know and understand. And then the next question was really more about how it gets implemented in terms of where that shows up. Yet I'm not going to run through this, but I think what we heard again in this survey, in the various comments and especially in the interviews was really a need for transparency. And I think there was a question earlier about a Rio-like dashboard or something similar. That will be addressed throughout the next couple of months as the process comes together. But I would say heard loud and clear, there needs to be information available. And then the secondarily is, what are the things that you'd like to see? And so just the call out, again, consistency across the process is important. And you'll see it somewhere on here, but the comment, I'd like a name to talk to and not an email box. I think, we can get into the details of what that may or may not look like. But I think we heard the frustration, but we also see that there are really tactical, concrete things on this communication side, which would make a difference, automated push notifications when something moves through the process, and an ability to kind of have that interface or know who to call or who to have a discussion with. Ideally, the need for that goes much lower or almost goes away if all the processes come into place. But that idea that you're going to be an interconnecting load and can actually understand where you sit was something that we, again, continue to hear pretty repeatedly. And pause there if we have questions, although this one I think is probably a little more straightforward.
Yeah, and we do have a slide later acknowledging there's the short-term improvements needed for communication and then longer-term portal type thing. But, yeah.
That's right.
Go on.
So I apologize if it feels like I'm rushing through. I think that the end ones get to be a little bit squishier. I will say, sorry, I will say there's an end cap here. So these last three questions are about the end-to-end process. This is, I'm struggling a little bit on how to present this slide. I don't want to call it a throwaway question, but we essentially said, would you rather be fast or accurate or both? It seems like both is the answer. Which I don't want to be flippant. I'm not meaning to dismiss the feedback. There is actually a real question here, and the issue comes that specific design decisions, which have very specific implications, really land across this. And so as an overarching framework to say, we heard 6 months is the process for the kind of the run rate batch study. And that there are things that are going to cause that to be longer if those decisions are made, whether it's commit windows or other pieces of it. That has been heard, and that the desire to not sort of stack those out to the point where this becomes an annual process is also very clear. And so as the process comes together, as the timelines fit, as the integration with other pieces of formal, whether it's the rulemaking or the steady state cadence come together, I think this is actually just reinforcement that folks understand you can't do everything down to the nth degree and do it in weeks rather than months. And so it's good feedback. It's kind of a nice sort of tie-in question that we actually put partly to make sure people were paying attention to the last, sort of get this section going to give us some feedback on the last box. The other question, and I know there have already been one or two comments in the room about whether or not restudies should ever be permitted. I think the theory and the goal here is that these batch study processes have a hurdle that means the loads that come in are quite serious and ready to meet the commitments to energize, that the allocation and commitment process doesn't result in so many dropouts that you reach a point where you're sitting in a position where a restudy feels nearly inevitable. What we heard is we would like to not have restudies, and as much as possible keep that not ironclad, but like as the defining characteristic here. However, there are exceptions and there are times when they'd be needed, but that if that turns again into a loop, this will have been a lot of work and effort to get to a place now where people feel like they're stuck again. And so there's a lot behind this question, and again, this isn't designed by survey, but the feedback has been heard that coming out of the batch study, the process to move forward and get on with building and whatever the next set of steps are to upgrade the system and to connect the load, folks would like to be able to do that as soon as possible.
And maybe if I can just interject. So an example of hearing y'all through the interviews was, if I'm not awarded 100 megawatts, I'm out. So now we're considering, well, maybe we should have minimum viable ramps that is part of what the stakeholder gives us. Here's the desired ramp, 500. Here's our minimum viable ramp is 100. And if we're not hearing the study, we're dropping out, then we can build that into our algorithm so we don't restudy after they drop out. We just keep dropping them out and going in without reopening the whole thing. So we are trying to, so if that's the case, how do we build it in to minimize dropouts and restudies? So again, any thoughts are open on that, but we can't just get stuck in that loop. So thanks, Jesse. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then I will close out with we'll still actually talk about the comments for a moment, but I will close out the survey on what was literally anything else you want to say. And so it's a nice segue into the more public comments. But again, we heard over and over, you can read the whole slide, but this idea of operationally ready, non-speculative, like how do we as a system move those projects forward, reduce the noise, and ensure that the economic development, the build that is associated with them comes forward. And then again, if you read down, there's a little bit of broken record here. I will say if you take the Venn diagram of all the different inputs and all of what was said across all of them, there's stuff that sits at the middle. The first one around prioritizing the projects that are real, again, difficult to identify but understood, as well as the frustrations around transparency and process standardization came through quite loudly. Everything else is just details. All the details matter an awful lot, but those were kind of the two headlines. So there's a lot of summary. I'd like to pause for comments and questions, and then we could spend maybe a few minutes on the open submissions before we move on to the next presentation.
So why don't you go ahead and go into the open submissions, because I think a lot of the themes connect, and then you can tease out what new information you found.
Sounds good. And in this case, so we'll skip these slides are all available. These are the summaries and could be the upfront ones, but I want to go through the detail. The summary on the public comments, we have 2 slides. Ideally, you'd cram them together and put them all in one piece of presentation because they really are consistent. But I would say we've highlighted 10 themes. Again, this isn't exhaustive, but you have all the source material. I will also say, just in the by way of ensuring you feel heard, we read all of them. This didn't get dumped into a model. These were all read and then synthesized. But I would say that the first 4, and there's one on the next slide, this was in response, as you recall, to the proposal on Tuesday of last week, which is now going to be changed somewhat. There was a lot of discussion around what does it look like to move into not just batch 0, but batch 0A, what are those timelines, and how is that process being organized? And so you'll see things like what are the cutoff dates that were proposed, as well as what is the eligibility criteria, and whether or not those projects that are actually asking for load, whether they're actually able to energize when they've said they are. The theme, again, I think every slide, or at least every section, we talk a bit about, controllable load resources, bring your own gen, co-located gen. I think the comment earlier about existing gen. Essentially, what we heard was, as a developer or as a project that wants to connect, there are ways where we think we can improve the system and move faster. We would like formal processes to be able to do that, and not just sort of sit in the same kind of queue as if we weren't bringing sort of a linked project. I will say this, so this is the first 5, and 4 of the 5 really to me were about kind of that entry into the batch process. We will have talked about virtually all of these in the last hour or 2, but if you look at the middle one, that sort of then links back to kind of what does it mean to get into the batches. I will say and we just spoke about the RTP, RPG alignment, and there'll need to be a lot of work done there. The one call out here that was probably not as prevalent in previous stakeholder interviews, but has actually been quite an active discussion, I would say, this morning, is around this idea of brownfield versus greenfield transmission, new rights of way, what actually needs to be included in the solution set in order to connect loads. I think heard loud and clear today and was coming through in the comments. So we just emphasize that's going to be part of the discussion. And then I'll just let you read the bottom one and say that we're probably in a good spot in receiving feedback on the good cause exception. So maybe that's a good place to actually open to kind of questions across the process.
Yeah, and if you don't mind going back to your 38, 39, what I wanted to do was get all the raw data out of the way. Mm-hmm. But then you're very helpful in the next 3 slides was what are the things to keep an eye on? If we heard a lot, we saw a lot of graphics, but this helped to boil down to the key themes from the free response. So Jesse, if you just wanted to take 5 more minutes to figure out 38, 39, 40, what you want to highlight is.
Yep.
Key information.
And maybe we'll call this the summary of what we talked through.
Yeah.
So this was the way that the survey was organized. The letters weren't on it, but it was broken up into modules. We'd say on the screening we heard a desire for standardization in the process, and that again, filters for speculative load and the ability to then have more assurance that the outcome of the batch was something that you could sort of take to the bank was an important piece of that. And so we wanted that consistency across utilities as well as the standardization. The eligibility criteria linked pretty heavily, we recognize, to the proposal from last week. But the push was, are projects really where they say they are? We want to make sure that there's also fairness in how the process is implemented, so that the economic development associated with many of these loads is able to move forward consistent with their expectations. Section C, again, this is about the actual nuts and bolts of the batch study, which is what is going to be hashed out in quite a bit of detail over the coming months. We heard the batch process was by and large something that was very well supported, but it needs to be executed on a reasonable timeline. The outcomes need to be something that the stakeholders can count on or can believe won't change, and that the timelines and the ramps, especially for longer lead upgrades that are necessary to support that load, need to be clear outcomes of the process. I'll say as we sort of walk through that, you jump from the batch to the allocate and commit. A lot of comments here, particularly the bulk of the free text responses really did link to what do you do at the end of the commit when not every load that was allocated was actually committed. Linked to, I know Matt made the comment earlier, I think as we sort of bring in parameters, we should reduce the amount of dropouts. But that reallocation of load is an important piece of this, as is the again, ensuring that allocation is linked to mature projects that will energize. Ideally, that will have been taken care of earlier in the project or the process, but it continues to be emphasized. We talked again, all this is a rehash, but RPG, and it's RPG here, not RTP, but understanding the RPG and the RTP and the batch study linkage, how closely they may become sort of in terms of process, and making sure that linkage doesn't create more burden and a slower timeline as opposed to speeding it up. We skipped over the financial commitments in our discussion, but there are certainly strong opinions. I think what we heard in a lot of cases in both the interviews as well as the survey, as well as the public comments, financial commitments are probably the easiest common denominator to ensuring projects are real, and it's the most sort of understandable one. The issue is that the level of that commitment in some cases may force out projects that actually were real if it's set too high. So there is a lot of nuance in what the right number is. This isn't the only gating factor, but it is an important one. And then at the end here, communications, we took the feedback in, and you'll see, examples of what we think what the output should look like. But having access to data to understand where you are in the process, who's got the ball in terms of the next steps, what needs to be done, where you're waiting, what's needed from you all as a large load to connect. All of that is clearly part of the process that is successful if we look back at this a year or two from now. And then how that's implemented really does matter. And so things like I mentioned before, push notifications and clarity on how you actually get access to that data, so you don't need to kind of know how to work the system. All of that comms piece has been from day one of the biggest themes of what we've heard from you all. And then finally, if you just sort of wrap this up, I think we talked about it at the beginning, leadership from ERCOT to create an end-to-end process that is transparent, where it feels fair. And again, fair is a subjective word, but it feels that way. And it also reduces the restudies and the finding out later that what you thought you had allocated wasn't there. Sort of the noise that creates problems for developers who are working toward connecting loads.
Very good. Thanks, Jesse. So let me kind of tell you where we're at. So I saw some body language in the room said, I didn't know it was ending at 1. So we have an hour left. The reason we did that is ERCOT this was the main part of it, is did we hear everything? Because we need to get to work on protocols, and that's why we need the balance of day for the team to go work on that. So we're going to go in fresh on what we hear today. So what we were going to do is pivot to say, of all these things we've heard, ERCOT has heard a lot of different themes, and here's some things that we have some not even answers to, but we agree, and these are the essence of what we're going after, and make sure that we're on the same page. So a lot of it's still TBD, but that's why we scheduled the day this way. Also, there's a food truck outside. There's a piece of paper that shows the menu. If you want to order online, you might be able to scan something, poke something, and they'll be out there till 1:30. But you're welcome to hear this. We're here till 1 o'clock, but you can still get food and come back in the cafeteria area, hang out, and try to figure out how to, cocktail napkin, figure out CLRs at ERCOT in this new realm, or cogen. So we encourage thought and continue on. But again, sorry for the shortness of this. And we do have people in the queue, and I even have the queue back to where Shannon Caraway was in the queue for the stuff earlier on the cogen stuff. So let me just work the names in front of me and see if there's anything we need to touch. But Durga and Prashanth, I think, asked a question. I'll try to answer, get back in the queue if I don't. The one was, would upgrades identified in the previous batch be included in the next batch study? Conceptually, we would like to get there, which is a new transmission project needed, rolls into the next, so it's part of the transmission grid that's then studied in the next batch for the new loads. So, and then the next question for Prashanth, do all RTP loads automatically get included in the batch process? So that's why we're trying to figure out how the RTP and the batch feed back and forth to each other. That's still TBD. So with that, Andres, I'll give you the question. Go ahead. You're in the queue.
Hi, this is Andres with Cypress Creek. I just want to emphasize the point that Clayton made, that RPG needs to happen inside the batch. But I believe the only way for that to make sense is also for ERCOT to do restudies inside the batch. Because the only way to validate transmission needs when people drop out, which they will, I mean, we see that in other markets outside of ERCOT, there's cluster studies, people always drop. Yes. The percentage of people who make the IA is very, very limited. Yep. So restudies need to happen, and the only way to validate transmission needs when people drop out is to do a restudy.
Yes.
One other thing, I haven't seen anything about cost allocation inside the batch. Last week, you guys mentioned megawatt allocation, but if the PUCT intends as their proposal that large loads will be paying their fair share and upgrades, the batch study also needs to address cost allocation. And the only way to do that is also to do restudies, because it wouldn't be fair for people to pay upgrades and then go through the RPG, taking a year for that without any certainty on that cost.
Yep. Completely acknowledge everything you said. The megawatts matter, the cost, if it's to be allocated out, matters, and that's down at the PUC. So, yeah, thank you for that. All right, Clayton.
Yeah, I want to get back to the post-processing piece, and it gets into that discussion as well. Can you guys focus for the next workshop on doing a very detailed dive on how the post-processing will work? There'll be a study run, and then there'll be results. And it's, like, let's say we're not doing any greenfield. It's 200 line upgrades. The TSPs are going to have to prioritize and figure out when those can be done. They'll have to go through and schedule all this stuff out, because then ERCOT has to use that schedule feedback to be able to provide that to the customer, because they're not going to get their load ramp. They're going to get some chunky thing that looks maybe like it, but is going to be in completely different years than what they were thinking. And the prioritization of those projects that the TSP does determines that. So do we need to have some sort of rulemaking on how that's done? There's fairness issues all through there that I don't know that people are really grasping, because we haven't gone through this. The main thing is to try to get this queue cleared out as possible, and get the line project started as quickly as possible so that we can get the load connected as quickly as possible. So if we can do a deep dive on the post-processing piece, I think that's going to be very important for the next workshop.
Very good. All right, thank you. Dhruv. I'm sorry if I said it wrong.
No, you said it correct. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Dhruv Gupta from Concord New Energy. So the large load modeling and submission requirements are still evolving. I believe DWG met TSPs this morning to discuss NOGRR 282 MQT requirements, and they're also drafting a figure for large load model submissions. So my question is, if new requirements are published in the coming months prior to the commencement of the batch study process, how will they impact projects already queued for batch 0, or would they be exempt from any new requirements?
I would say the revision request, that revision request will have a implementation pathway defined.
All right, thank you, Jeff. All right, Justin?
Justin Cockrell, DC Energy. There's been a lot of discussion about transparency for project developers, which I can appreciate, and I think that's important for them. But what about the concern for transparency for the wider market? You know, with these large loads are very impactful. I think they're really analogous to putting a generator on the system, and that really does affect the wider market. And so I'm concerned about transparency for everyone else and where that will come in the batch study process.
Okay, and I think that's been brought up. So it's whether or not loads should be disclosed and all that piece. So yeah, so noted. Thank you. I'll put that in the transparency circle, and when the NPR comes out, we can be wrestling over what transparency looks like. Thanks for that feedback.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. Shilpi, last one.
Yeah, hi, this is Shilpi Sunil Kumar with Amara. Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So the discussion's been great, and I was hoping to hear a little bit more about certain scenarios. So just wanted to flag that to you all. Maybe that's something you want to answer now or for the next workshop, perhaps. So thinking about scenarios, one where, say, a load is already energized on the ERCOT system and it's following its ramp schedule as planned. And if that load wants to file or has filed for a capacity expansion at that particular location, would those requests also need to go through the batch study process? And I wonder how would that fit in with a new load perhaps, or it just follows like the standard new process that, say, whatever we come up with. So that's one thought. And other that I was thinking about is a scenario, say, where for some reason, due to business or market environment, whatever, a load decides to change, say, from Bitcoin mining to AI, HPC or something. And I wonder how those kind of requests would be treated. Would they require to go through the new load study process, or since that load is already existing on the system and has been previously studied, if you would look to treat that a little bit differently? So just thinking about how those scenarios, say, would fit into this broader discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll say we have thought about those scenarios. I don't think that we have an answer on how we would handle those today, but I'll say that's part of the conversation we're having.
And there's definitely the idea of getting across the finish line on the batch 0 process that then says, what's the forever process that we link into also? All right, so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to turn the page over to AG. So just a reminder, so if you've seen Jeff at the commission, he's been walking around with the 12 issues that we've been hearing feedback on, and what are these key things. So we want to try and touch each of those today before we get out of here with what that looks like. And then I'll go back to the last slide, which is what our schedule look like for the rest of the process. So, over to you.
All right. So yeah, AG Springer, ERCOT. So as Matt mentioned, we're going to cover some of the ERCOT feedback on the feedback we've received on the 12 topics that are and so as we go through these, I think you're going to hear a lot of retreading of the issues that we've already had in the discussion today and reinforcing. I'll just kind of reiterate at the top that we did review the feedback that it was submitted after the last workshop, the points that were raised have been heard. We don't have a ton of answers on these topics today, but this kind of represents where our thinking is given the changes that have happened after the last workshop.
categorized the sort of areas of these topics. So some are batch zero, some are just overall process related, and there are a couple technical topics in there. And so we'll go through them and we can take questions as well. So starting with the first one, so the batch zero snapshot dates and cutoffs. So the feedback we got was the questioning around whether retroactive snapshot dates, or other lines that were drawn invalidate work that's already been completed. I think really our main feedback here is that because of the changes and the guidance that we got since the last open meeting, those dates that we presented for batch 0A and batch 0B really they aren't going to work anymore. And so, we're going to be, as we bring these revision requests forward, thinking very carefully about the feedback that we did receive on this topic, as well as how all that feedback and our thinking aligns with the PUC projects 58, 480, and 481, as well as the other guidance and the requirements in Senate Bill 6. So, I guess the overarching message is, what we presented last workshop really doesn't fit anymore, and so we'll be bringing forward the new cutoff and eligibility criteria in the revision requests. Moving on to the timeline. So we presented at the last workshop, and I'll pause here for just a moment and remind everybody that at the bottom of this deck is our complete slide deck from the last workshop. So if you go to the appendix, you can find details on a lot of what I'm talking about here. You don't have to go back to the other workshop. We put it there as well. We did receive feedback that the June 2027 energization cutoff was probably unrealistic for customers who hadn't started construction, and potentially disadvantage other projects that were more realistic in what they had submitted. And so, kind of the same response here is, we're going back to the drawing board a little bit here, and so we'll not be using those energization dates to determine, if we're trying to do a quick study, because there isn't going to be that batch 0A anymore. We will do a more comprehensive batch 0 that will be defined in the revision requests that are forthcoming. Okay, this seems to have been the big topic today. CLR, treatment of CLRs, treatment of bring your own generation or other co-location. What are the rules going to be around this? There were a lot of questions about specifics here. How are they going to be treated? How are they going to be modeled? Do they have to sign up early? Do they have to sign up late? I think Jesse's presentation got into a lot more specifics than what we got on this slide. So going to emphasize at the top that really probably, ERCOT's thinking is, and we'll probably be covering it this way going forward, is that controllable load resources are really a separate issue from bring your own generation or co-location. And that's going to be reflected in the revision requests. So we think of them as two separate issues. We're going to kind of talk about them separately here and probably going forward. So I can't remember if it was Jeff or somewhere in our earlier discussion, we covered the approach, which is going to be, we're going to file revision requests that try to address these issues, and they'll be covered through separate sets of revision requests that will be modularly kind of able to connect with the main batch 0 revision request. And if we're able, and there's consensus, we're able to move it forward on the same timeline, then that's the target. But they'll be designed in such a way that they plug into each other, but they're not dependent on each other. And so the goal will be to try and move them forward together. So here's our current thinking on the CLR, MPR, and potentially PIGR. Will be revision requests that kind of have these main pieces that we articulated in the last workshop that we feel would be needed for this concept to be viable. would be the first piece would be allow a large load to declare its intent to register as a CLR and be treated accordingly in the study process. The second piece would be to create a binding framework that would require the large load to register as a CLR once operational and to have some sort of exit path out of that. So I think the details of that are still being thought about, but that I think is a really key piece from ERCOT's thinking, is that if there's credit for being a CLR in planning, there needs to be an obligation to actually become a CLR in operation. The third kind of tentpole of this revision request would be additional or updated SCED methodology to ensure that the CLR is dispatched to resolve constraints in real-time operations and not instead allow the constraint to just violate. And that's, again, we credited that we could solve the constraint with the CLR in planning, and there needs to be a way to ensure that happens. So I think we'll have more details to share on that one as well in future workshops. And then finally, some clearer definition about how the CLR will be treated in other planning assessments to ensure that transmission is ultimately built to serve it. So I think that kind of ties up with the potential exit criteria. But I think the thinking is that the CLR would be locked in for some period of time or until some system conditions exist, and then would have a path out if it elected to do so. I'm going to go through the next slide, and then we can. I saw we got. Okay, all right. So then turning to this concept of bring your own generation. So this would be a separate set of revision requests that have these kind of 4 tent poles. First would be to create a definition of, what do we mean technically by the phrase that we kind of hear often when around this topic, which is, the load is never seen from the grid, or, never going to have to be served. Well, we need to get into the physics of that. What does that really mean? What are the requirements around that? And associated obligations. I think that's the first thing we have to define is what do we mean there? We need to define if there are either some studies that were required for freestanding loads in the batch that are still needed even if they're located with generation, or if there are additional studies, scenarios that might need to be included for this setup. Again, especially around a stability type assessment. The details are going to be important there. One question that we have had as we've digested the feedback we received here too is around the allowed modes of participation of that generation in the market. If that generation is being credited to the load, do we need additional rules there? I think that's still to be determined. And then finally, this was going back to the earlier discussion, having a more formal link between the large load and the generation interconnection request. I think that's again another kind of important component of this. That if under the current process, there really is no different treatment of generation locating with load, or load locating with generation, and so there doesn't need to be that firm link. But if the bring your own generation type project is going to be assessed differently in planning, then there needs to be that link. And so we're still thinking about that, but there is the potential for allowing, if there's multi-stages of the generation build out, then potentially load could kind of come on concurrently with that, and potentially is there an exit path after some amount of time. I think those are topics that are still being discussed. So before I move off the slide, I'm just going to emphasize again, the intent is to bring each of these topics as separate revision requests, but that would tie together with the overall batch 0 revision request that we're pushing for the June board. If we can move them along in the same timelines, then that's great, and we support that. But that's the plan there. Okay. Gosh, we're only on number 4. Okay, I'm going to try and go a little faster so we can get out of here by 1. Okay, so clarity around allocations and how that aligns with RTP, RPG. I think we've talked about this a lot already. ERCOT has heard the feedback. We understand the concern here and the importance to all stakeholders, and we share that goal of this overall process resulting in certainty for all parties. So we'll have more to share on that at a future workshop. Eligibility for batch 0, IA, financial gates. So, I think this is another area where with the guidance at the last open meeting, the criteria we shared in the last workshop really isn't valid anymore. So we're going to continue to consider what we got in feedback, the upcoming rulemakings, Senate Bill 6, the other factors we talked about, and we will bring forward clear criteria in the next revision request. Okay, so we did get some technical questions. The first one was around stability models and the stability study process. Stakeholders were looking for some clarity around whether the stability screening and later stability study that we talked about in our slides on the last workshop could result in changes to the megawatt allocations. And then the other question was around clarity about what would be required for model quality and validation. I'm going to take those in reverse order. So the stability models, because we need more clarity even in the current process around these models. We've had a market notice that has existed since last June, requiring the DWG large load survey and dynamic models for current interconnection requests. We are also expecting a PIGR to be submitted in the near future that will provide much more robust language around that, and that will be going through the stakeholder process kind of independently of the batch because, again, that clarity is needed in the current process. And so that would be applicable to the batch process as well, is those model quality requirements. Onto the stability screening, I think the most important issue that we are concerned about is voltage stability. And so there will be that screening assessment during the batch study process. But the thinking is at the moment that the subsequent stability analysis would not impact the megawatt allocations. It's really determining if there's additional reactive devices that might need to be in place to support, but it wouldn't result in a limitation on the load. Okay, sequencing. So I think we've talked about this one a lot today. We've heard the feedback again about screening, the study process, the timeline, and who's accountable and responsible at each step. We're working with the TSPs closely to determine what's possible here and division of responsibilities. So I think the next workshop will have a lot more detail to share there. Deposits, cost allocations, dropouts. So we've heard today, the last workshop, there needs to be more clarity around who pays for upgrades, how deposits are treated. I think for these, most of my answers are going to be related, back to the commission. So SB 6 directs the commission to evaluate transmission cost allocation methods. 58481 as well as 58484 are the projects that kind of speak to that. Same with treatment of deposits for transmission upgrades. I don't see that as an issue that's going to be resolved through our revision requests. That's really through the rulemaking. And then finally, reallocation. If load drops out, we already had a little discussion on that today. We will continue to think about that and determine, when and how that reallocation might take place, and address it through the revision requests. All right, I see we got a queue building. If everyone can just hold on, we got 4 more, and then we'll take questions. This is another kind of, we've got a lot of questions around why approval dates were used as eligibility for batch 0 criteria. just a note on our high-level thinking. The approval dates, we considered those as an objective metric that represented progress through the current process. And so that's why those were chosen. We did receive a lot of comments about, questions about whether, there were unfairly disadvantaging customers that had some sort of delay from the TSP side or from the ERCOT side. And I think it's really hard to measure that objectively. So that's why we chose the metrics that we did. However, this is another case where the changes since the last workshop really kind of render that moot. So we will have more discussion on this at the next workshop. Transparency, we've heard you loud and clear on the need for transparency. We agree that there needs to be not only more transparency, but a single source of information so that there's not a game of telephone going between customer, ERCOT, and TSPs. And so we're kind of thinking on this on a two-track approach. So in the near term, we're looking at how we might share some periodic status reports that can be then shared with the customers, so that you get this view of kind of, here's how ERCOT sees your project at the moment. And then as a long-term solution, we've initiated development of a self-service portal similar to Rio. It may not be exactly Rio, but along those lines where there's a place to submit information as well as a place to see where your project stands. And so that's the long-term thinking. Load allocation methodology. There was some questions around requesting clearer explanation about how load allocation might be done under different scenarios. I will point back to, there was a slide in our February 3rd presentation that did kind of give an example of how we're thinking about that. But the high-level feedback there is we're thinking that the load allocation within a batch will be really based on the impact that the large load customer has on the constraints that are identified within the batch. So, a load that is more impactful would likely see, greater limitation in the near term than a customer that's less impactful. But again, if you want to get into that in a little bit more detail, go back to the slides from our presentation at the February 3rd workshop. Okay, last but not least, questions around good use of good cause exception. This one, given the guidance from the February 6th open meeting, is also kind of moot at this point. We will be pursuing batch zero through a revision request process.
Yeah. All right, so let me just make a couple statements and we'll open up for questions. If you don't mind going to the next slide, AG, save me a walk. There we go. Okay, so we have a long journey on all these topics. What AG just touched on, if you didn't catch it, the first part was timing. We found that timing was a big deal. Retroactive dates are bad. There's a lot of things that we heard. So as we develop the NPR, we're going to be thinking about dates and approvals and what does it look like. And it will be likely in protocol language. So it's all here to look at. When it's about things like what does the walk down on this look like, it's the idea this NPR would say, well, what does it mean in terms of criteria to get into the batch? And then once it's in the batch, what's ERCOT's role? What's the TSP's role? How does this output then have a selection and a dropout thing? And do you restudy it or not? And then does this feed into the RPG projects? And if it does, or if they don't, then how do they feed back? So we're trying to walk through all of that right now. And that's why the workshop's short today, because we're going in a room to beat up a whiteboard. But what we could use your help on is if you know of a way, for example, I'm not going to look at people as I say this, if you know how to define this new controllable load resource, please do, because current protocols don't support what we're looking at. I would call this a limited CLR, because we would enter a CLR into the system that's 0 megawatts, and that they're allowed to wander off that on off-peak times. But if they do, they have to have an offer curve that represents a financial point at which they'll never operate. So if there's a constraint, it'll back it down, schedule back them down to 0 and park them there. Well, there's a lot of shift factors, costs, and prices that need to be considered, or algorithms to consider. And whether or not you want to start to put a pencil to paper on things like that, that would be fantastic. And to AG's point, and are they CLRs forever, or do they phase out? So if you want to pull, I just rattled off the batch 0 thread. Now it's the CLR thread, and then I'll pivot and not look at someone else. Cogen thread, what does it look like if it's a cogen? Would they ever operate injecting or withdrawing? And how do we arrest a significant event behind the fence to get it? So there's all these layers. So what I don't want to promise is AG made it sound like, you didn't, it was my slide, sorry. We made it sound like that we're going to come forward on March 4th with all these ideas, and we don't have them all yet. So we're going to focus on the batch process. But when it comes to CLRs, we need help on what that can look like. Old days, it would be a TNT white paper. Somebody goes out and whips that thing out. Open to groups doing that. We're not going to try to organize that, but you have the right. So for those two topics. So I just want to let you know, if you're like, what can I be doing to help? Those one-offs are things that we could use help on, and then we just need some space to work through the planning piece and how this fits together, RPG, and we are talking to the wires companies also to see how this fits. So that being said, we can still get back to the questions at hand, although I saw you perk up on one thing there. Clayton, go ahead.
Well, Figure 134 has been in process for several months now. A lot of these questions that you're asking have been answered.
And that's okay. You can point to that, but I'm saying mechanically be thinking about how this all fits.
Absolutely.
Yep.
The main thing you're needing is contractual, binding contracts.
Yep.
Some of the things that you don't have currently on the CLR.
Yep. Just working through the details. So,
exactly.
Yep, exactly.
And I think that we've got a pathway forward on that as well. We can do that as Figure 134, and you wouldn't even have to do an NPRR on that if you prefer.
Well, we're just looking at draft languagey stuff and principles and thoughts to get into. So whether we start with red lines from that, but thank you for connecting the dots. 134 is one place to start from, but that's okay. So also, Evan, did you want to share one? No, let me come back to you on this piece on the protocol stuff. So let's work the queue. I'm going to stop at 10 minutes till, okay, so we have 20 minutes of just questions and answers on whatever you want from today. I'm going to land on this slide of what's ERCOT's piece of getting this out. TAC leadership is still weighing in on how this fits together to move forward. So working the queue, we'll start with Bill Barnes.
So on the CLR topic, what will be very helpful is to clearly define what ERCOT will accept and consider as a CLR versus one that has generation. We've talked to more than a handful of developers, customers that think they're a CLR, but they're relying on generation, like a battery. If ERCOT's going to accept that as a CLR, like a non-modeled, it's a, behind the scenes, backup, more of a backup gen type of facility, or a battery system that's not going to be revealed to ERCOT in some way, and it just looks like it's part of the load that reduces the load. We need to know very clearly if ERCOT's going to accept that as a CLR, because I think that's most of what we're seeing that's out there. Mm-hmm. And I know in some discussions I've had with ERCOT, which is the ERCOT folks I've talked to are not here, they said that is not a CLR. So just clearly define what you are considering as a CLR will be very helpful. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. All right, next is Shannon.
Can we go back to slide 11? I've kind of got a question and then maybe a comment on this. On the first sub-bullet, the create a definition that captures the technical requirements needed for some or all the large load to, quote, never be seen by or served by the grid. My question is this. Is that meant to be a scenario you're thinking about looking at, or are you thinking that is the only scenario you're looking at under this behind the meter? And then I can ask or comment.
Yeah, Shannon, I can take that one. So there's definitely an aspect of summarizing to fit it onto a slide. At our presentation for the February 3rd workshop, we laid out 4 scenarios, and even those were not comprehensive. So, I think we would consider whether, a portion of the load could never be seen by the grid, or, whether or not it's a load that is only served from the generation under normal operating conditions, but may need some time to execute a controlled shutdown if the generation's not there. Things that is really meant, I think the trickiest one from a technical perspective is the some or all the load is never seen by the grid, and I think we'll need to define what that means.
Yeah, when I think of that one, truly never, then really, what's ERCOT saying? If it's never, then it's an island. So I'm hoping for sure that you're looking at the grid connected, but you're bringing gen and load in synchronism, and almost just simplistically assume you've got 5 100 megawatt generators on an N-1, and if there was no grid capacity available before you came, it would seem to me that on a grid connected one, on a G-1, so you'd lost one of the 5 100 megawatt generators. If we do this right, you should be able to still serve 400 megawatts of load on a G-1, N-1 secure basis. So if y'all are at least looking at that type of scenario, I think that's going to be one of the more common modes, because just going and building something that's totally island, never connects, those are not, they're there, but they're very unique. Generators want to be connected, loads want to be connected. The grid's worth something.
Yeah, I think that's maybe why AG is pointing back to those scenarios to make sure we build the rules to address the scenarios.
Yeah. And I would also add that, in scope of BYOG is synchronously connected load and generation.
All right. Next question or comment. Bharat.
Yeah, more of a comment. I think if ERCOT can come back next week at the LLWG to explain more about RTP and especially the 26 RTP versus how we are going to correlate with batch studies, it would be super useful because the April 1st deadline for RTP to firm up is coming up. So we just want to kind of understand the downside of not being RTP loads. So that's one. Second one is, I know we have a lot of workshops scheduled, so if you can kind of focus on only specific topics for each workshop, I think those will be super prudent, in my opinion, than a lot of covering wide range of topics. Two things.
Yeah, so I think on the first part, not going to have that at LLWG. Hope to have that at the February 26th workshop. But I would say what happens with RTP is independent. Like you shouldn't do anything special for the RTP based on what may or may not happen with the batch. I think that's really independent.
Okay, so these loads will continue to go through the bigger 115 process right now.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if they're firmed up in RTP or not. Okay, thanks.
All right, next is Sam Jung.
Hi, Sam Jung from EPE. One comment and a question on slide 14, dynamic studies. I guess I just wanted to say that please take into account that like early submission of dynamic data, which is going to be required, often lead to developers submitting a generic dynamic models based on, NERC recommended parameters or like a default parameters rather than like the actual behavior of the equipment. I think it'll be ideal to have some way to get around that, maybe have some sort of like vendor or equipment specification at the time of the interconnection request, as that'll show that the vendor is serious. I mean, the developer is serious. They're showing the operational readiness and probably have some financial, commitment in there as well. So that's just one comment there. And then the second is on the load allocation on slide 19. The load allocation methodology presented in the February 3rd workshop slides were only valid on thermal constraints, and I believe the stakeholder feedback were likely on the voltage and system stability side. I guess when ERCOT finalizes this allocation methodology, can ERCOT schedule like a technical workshop that for those who perform the stability, maybe like TSPs or consultants can attend, or anyone actually, but to see, I guess, how ERCOT would allocate the megawatts based on voltage and system non-convergence violations.
Yeah, and Sam, to your last point, we're definitely thinking about different themes or different portions of the workshop, kind of like Prasant said, that we need to have an orderly criteria. So people focus on criteria for 2 hours, other people on different pieces. So, yeah, so noted. Thank you for that. But yes, there's more work to be done on those other constraints.
Thank you.
You bet. Bob.
Yeah, touching on Sam's comments a minute ago on the DWG and the dynamics, I think we really need to think carefully about that, slide 14. This equipment that's going to be installed, some of it is, 4 years from the time you're submitting the data. That equipment has not been invented yet. So I think some kind of it will be better than this, criteria is probably applicable. And then even that equipment that hasn't been invented yet, it's going to be changed out continuously as we go along. So those dynamic studies are never truly going to be accurate. So I think we really need to think about some sort of, you will be better than this, and then when your equipment is actually brought online, some sort of update that reflects what's really installed, and then an ongoing, we've changed out 20% of the equipment, and now looks like this. I think we need to really think through that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Bob. Andres.
Hi, it's Andres with Cypress Creek. Can you go back to slide, it's actually that one. Question on that last sentence that you guys have. Subsequent stability analysis will not result in reduction of megawatt allocation. Will that still be true if the QSA determines a GTC is needed or a GTC needs to be updated? I'm just curious if that statement will still be true.
So I think that is true from we are going to plan for that load. However, I think I had a slide on this at the last workshop. That does not mean that the load may never be subject to being curtailed in real time. Operations needs to maintain reliability, and they will do whatever is necessary to maintain reliability. So if there's a situation that comes up in real time in which they need to curtail the load, then they will curtail the load for stability purposes or any other purposes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ned?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Brought my computer just to get it right, not because I have something lengthy. Bullet 4, slide 11, you mentioned you want to prevent loads from energization until the generation comes up. I think in most cases, these large loads are going to be coming up in phases with limited megawatts and then ramping up over time, right? So the question is that truly what you mean? And if so, it's not in the case of Sandow Lakes Ranch. I should have identified myself, but we'll be meeting 100% of the needs of our load. But what do you do if you're only meeting 50% with your generation? This wouldn't even qualify. So I think maybe this is the fine art of truncating a bullet too much. Okay. Just want to confirm.
Yeah. So I'll just as easy. I'll make a couple of comments here. So yes, as with my response to Bill's question, there were more scenarios, or maybe it was Shannon. Sorry, whoever on this side of the room that I missed there. There were more scenarios we presented in the February 3rd slide deck, and even those were not comprehensive. The intention, maybe different way to say what we got up on the screen here is, for the portion of the load that is served by the new co-located generation, there needs to be that link, because potentially, and again, the details are still being worked out, that's that second bullet there, how do we assess that in planning? Potentially, we may not assess all the scenarios we would have assessed if it had been served from just the transmission system with the assumption that generation is serving the load. And so if that turns out to be how it is described in the revision request, then that generation would need to actually be there to serve that load before that load could come on the system. And I think that's really what we're trying to articulate there, is that for that portion of load that's served by generation, if it is getting credit for that in the planning assessments, the generation has to be there before the load can come on, because we have not assessed, or we have assumed the generation is there to serve that load and it's not being served by the transmission system.
Okay, so it's a component of the study itself. Okay. Could you still weave in, if in our case we've got 1,200 megawatts of power, 1,200 megawatts of load, if they come in and say we need 100 megawatts to get kicked off, and Encore says fine, which I know Liz always says fine, sorry, Liz. I don't see why that would be an impediment. So there's not going to be a prohibition. They put it another way. There's not going to be a prohibition on the load coming up with 100 megawatts if Encore says we can serve 100 megawatts. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
I don't think that's been defined yet.
Okay.
Certainly having multiple scenarios in the study introduces complexity, and I just don't think we've determined how we're going to treat that.
Okay. Thank you. No pressure, Liz.
Thanks, Ned. All right. Prashanth, Go ahead.
Hey, this is Prashant from Black Mountain. I have a follow-up comment on what Bharat asked regarding the RTP loads to be included in the batch process.
Prashant, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm having a hard time hearing you. Could you maybe speak a little closer to your microphone?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Oh, sorry. So I want to follow up on my previous comment regarding what loads get added to the batch process. Our comment is basically whatever the loads that gets from RTP into the batch process should meet the same criteria as batch zero projects, because that could have significant impact on batch zero projects if there are several gigawatt of RTP projects that have not gone through the studies but gets included in the batch process. So that's one comment that we have. And one question I have is, would the batch zero process, I know the previous batch zero will not recommend any upgrades. Would the batch zero upcoming one would recommend transmission upgrades?
Yeah, so to your second question, the intent is for this batch zero that will be defined through the revision request to be a more comprehensive study that would consider transmission upgrades. So think something closer to the batch zero B that we described at the last workshop. Not saying it will be exactly like that, but that would be closer to the scope that we'll likely propose.
All right, thank you. Sam Brandon?
Hey, Sam Brandon with Agentic. With respect to the necessary revision requests that will be needed for CLRs and BYOG, I'm kind of trying to read between the lines a little bit. It sounds like, the existing stakeholder submitted rule requests or revision requests have been ongoing for a little bit now. It sounds like ERCOT staff is a bit hesitant to say that those efforts can help inform what the go forward revision requests might need to be. So in terms of just, being as productive as possible to help advance some of these issues, is there an alternative that's more productive than working with these existing requests? Because I think, like for the, offer mitigation, that's already gone through the congestion management working group in some form of discussion. And then Figure 134 has been out there for a while with stakeholder feedback. So,
yeah, no, good point. So sorry, I went off script. I haven't kept up with what all is going on in those other realms. So thanks for a poke in the right direction. And a lot of other people are involved. We've been more involved in the planning group on this piece. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Definitely one key thing is if it points to a figure that's 100 pages long and is woven into everything, is sometimes seeing the forest for the trees. If we just have a white paper that says, here's the key elements of what it is and how it should incorporate, that helps too. I'm not asking for another deliverable. I'm just helping for smart thoughts in one place so we can have a good conversation about it when we get to the meeting. So ERCOT starting with a blank. I am starting with a blank piece of paper in some areas. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Thanks.
Gotcha. No, super helpful. And sorry, one quick follow-up is just...
I'm sorry, Sam, but I want to add on a little bit to what Matt has said. I think one thing that we do want to convey through this slide is that, these are, I think, 4 of the most important principles that any revision request would need to contain in order to really fully address the CLR issue. And, I think there's been, Figure 134 has been brought up a few times in this meeting, and I think whether that is the vehicle or I think our thinking is more along the lines of an ERCOT-sponsored set of revision requests, but they need to address these four areas, and I have not seen anything out in the stakeholder process that currently does so.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, at the end of the day, we just want to be as productive as possible and working through the right channels to answer all these questions. So that makes sense. And then my quick follow-on to that same thread was for the BYOG concept. Previously, we talked about this G-1, N-1 constraint on the scenario 3 case for that. And so is the current understanding that if you have a co-located project that gets caught by a G-1, N-1, is it that there would just, because that's a TPL planning case, would that still need to, would the upgrades resolving that constraint still need to be made before that project's approved to energize, or is it suggesting that project would be able to energize and then curtail if G-1 N-1 existed in real time?
Yeah, I think that latter one is what we're trying to explore. Is there a way to look at these sites differently? So we've studied them traditionally to where if a gen is next to a load, we still have to study them as if one fails and the other doesn't. So what does the world look like if you link those two together operationally and contractually to where when you lose part of one, you lose part of the other, and it's a net zero risk to the system? So I think that's what other ISOs are trying to figure out too. So we're, again, open to thoughts on how to do that.
Okay, so yeah.
All right, Ian, and we're coming up. I'll just say I'm watching the clock, so people may jump in the queue, but they may not get to the microphone. So Ian, you're next, and then Clayton.
Thanks. Ian Haley, Morgan Stanley. A couple things for this moving forward, not on particular criteria, but we've had a lot of conversations in ERCOT recently about words have meaning, and I think this might be another place where we just need some new words. I think we need to differentiate a little bit more in these conversations between what we're trying to decide in batch 0 versus the later batches. And then I also think we need to have a conversation about what can we get into batch 1 and what are nice to haves in batch 2 plus. I understand there is a lot of desires for special things, but those may hold up the process, and people probably, if they realize they'll hold up batch 0, batch 1, et cetera, will be more willing to let that go into batch 2, et cetera. On the criteria of how these decisions are being made on the bright lines, I'm hoping ERCOT can give us the bookends of what they considered and why they consider those the bookends. Whether that just be data to show us, X megawatts are available at this time if we use this date, X megawatts are included this time if we use this date. And I lean that in because other ISOs go through this process a little differently, the stakeholder process. They use almost like a Mad Libs process, where you fill in, you want this part for here and this part for here. And as a TAC member, that's what I'm going to have to do at the end of the day. So a single MPRR that has criteria all over the place, I shouldn't say it that way. A single MPRR that has maybe a dozen pieces of criteria of what gets included in batch 0 will drive us at TAC mad because we will have different people debating different things. So if we understand those bookends, we take away conversations that don't need to happen. And by highlighting what those criteria pieces are that are able to be moved, we can actually have conversations about what they are and what they could be. And then I apologize, one other thing is just if criteria leans on other criteria, that is something us stakeholders will need to understand. If we move A, B needs to be moved as well, things like that. So thank you very much for all the work on this so far.
Yeah, very good. And you reminded me, maybe as we're tackling some of these issues over the next 6 weeks, that's a batch 1 or a steady state batch process to worry about. Let's get parking lot, that one, focus on batch 0.
I think that'd be great. I think getting the batch process off the ground is the most important thing.
Yep.
Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
I think getting the batch process off the ground and stable is the most important thing, and then adding on bells and whistles, accessories, whatever you want to call it afterwards is a great thing to do, but after we get it up and steady.
Yeah, and something that, I don't know that we explicitly stated this, so let me state it now so it's clear. We are envisioning 4 sets of revision requests here. So there will be a batch 0, and I say set, again, it may be a single NPRR or it may be an NPRR and a figure that's still under discussion, but there will be a batch 0 set of revision requests. There will be an ongoing or steady state or whatever you want to call it. There will be a set of revision requests for that. There will be a co-located / bring your own generation set of revision requests, and there will be a CLR set of revision requests. So those are the 4 that I have in mind.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I did not appreciate that. That's great to hear.
Hey, Matt.
All right. Yeah, Barksdale,
Thanks.
go ahead. Sorry, Barksdale gets to cut in line.
I apologize. I try to be quiet as much as possible. But, Ian, I'm not sure that I'm going to contradict you, but you said, I think I heard you say, the most important thing is to get the batch 1 right. And I'm just going to say the most important thing is to get batch 0 to the June board meeting, bar anything else.
Sorry, Barksdale. What I meant is to get the batch process correct, and the June board meeting is non-negotiable for what I heard on Friday. So that's not even a consideration. It has to be done.
And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Barksdale.
All right. So we're down to the last 4 people, Clayton, then Suma, Rishi, and Gideon. And at that point, I'll try to wrap it up. Clayton.
2 pieces, one on Ian's comments. Probably the most controversial issue is going to be who goes in batch 0. And so I don't think that's a decision that needs to be made here. I think that what we are responsible for here is to frame up ideas, put those in front of the commission, and let them weigh in. I think that's the appropriate place for that. I think that solves most of the problems. The other problem is going to be in like the allocation piece, and that gets into this whole RPG outside of, if you run the batch, I mean, just using what we have today, you run the batch, you get all of these upgrade projects, your cost allocation is going to, and your timelines, more importantly, are going to be based on that. Now you go into an RPG process and you say, well, instead of doing these 10 upgrades, I can put in 1 line. That line's not going to have the same time frame as those 10 upgrade projects, so now somebody's timeline just got changed that you've already given them allocation of megawatts for. The projects, those upgrade projects, went into the next batch. Now that's going to provide different results than that line upgrade would provide. So, I mean, these things compound. That's why I'm saying that we need to spend some quality time on this post-processing. And then on the allocation piece as well, how much somebody uses the line, is that just basically a shift factor allocation? Because a line that's needed for one of our projects probably has a near zero shift factor allocation under normal operations, but under certain contingencies it has, I guess a more material amount. So, it's like, then you get into, okay, which contingency are you going to use? Are you going to use the most limiting for the entire system, most limiting for each project? I mean, you get into this, accounting nightmare. So just throw that out there.
Thank you. Suma, then Rishi, then Gideon.
Yeah, thank you. I think somebody else already asked this question, and I heard Jeff's comment on it, that you won't be ready for next week's LLWG to discuss anything about the 2026 RTP with respect to large loads. I understand that. But my question is more about the market notice that came out yesterday, ERCOT requesting TSPs, TDSPs to include large loads meets the criteria of 58,480. And we received a notice from our TSP requesting the same. Will ERCOT make a note of this and make sure that that's not one of the criteria that will be included when y'all come up with a draft on what should that criteria be for batch 0 or batch 1?
So, not sure I understand the question.
So we have a deadline of end of March to respond back to TSP on if we're going to meet the criteria for 58,480 to be included in 2026 RTP. However, ERCOT probably don't have what that criteria is going to look like, because previously last workshop we had February 3rd. If they are part of the 24, 25 RTP, then they straight going to these batch 0A, right? So will that be a criteria?
Yeah, it's, I would say the RTP is, I think, separate from, so think of RTP as that criteria for 2026 RTP is separate from batch. So whatever the 58,480 rule says for that 2026 RTP compliance plan, that is applicable to that 2026 RTP. I think it's to be determined if we will use that or something different for the batch process. So I think it's really, I would really just, for the 2026 RTP, I would say focus on what the rule says and follow that. And then how we think about that in the batch process, I think that's separate and to be determined.
So there is a chance that if we are not going to be included in 2026 RTP, then we may not go into batch 0 or batch 1 when it gets determined.
And vice versa.
I'm sorry.
And vice versa. I mean, I think it's, I think we're not sure if that is relevant for the batch or not.
Gotcha.
All right. Hey, I know it's 1 o'clock, but Jeff, you just made a lot of people have a lot of questions, and I think it's worth being careful about that answer.
Yep.
So there's emails about inclusion in batch, in the RTP process that have gone out from one or more utilities recently. That is the talk of the town. And so right now, there's not a specific plan to say that inclusion in the batch process is dependent on inclusion in the RTP, right? Is that also true?
That is true.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I may, since Encore is one of the utilities that's sent out one of those letters, in case we weren't as clear as we tried to be, we Encore are not in a position to make any promises about what inclusion in the 2026 RTP load forecast gets a customer. What we have said is, please do this because we think it's important for purposes of the RTP. But we understood it the way Jeff just described it, which is right now there is not a clear line of sight between the 2026 RTP load forecast and the batch study process and the ultimate award of capacity.
Makes sense. There's some uncertainty, but it's entirely possible for a world to exist where there's criteria to include in the batch that is separate and distinct from inclusion in the RTP.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Arushi, go ahead. And this, I'm going to have to cut off the last three. So it's Arushi, Gideon, Shannon, and then I'll wrap up. Go ahead, Arushi. And if you're talking, we don't hear you yet. Okay. We'll come back to you. Gideon.
I yield. It's getting late. So.
All right. Shannon.
Pulling on the thread that Jeff opened up a moment ago and Eric and Liz commented on, if we look at your February 3rd presentation where in 0B, the RTP or RPG would be included in it, the way I'd been thinking about it, and I could be wrong, the odds are I am wrong, so I'd like some clarification, is to go into the batch 0 or batch whatever, the criteria that's going to come out of 58481 will inherently be different to go into as an allocated load versus, when you come out, then so the question that was asked earlier, are those going to be the same? I think if I'm following it right, they're inherently different for the loads going in as an allocation. My comments earlier about the going in as firm, if you're in the RTP, was really just predicated off of the structure y'all had laid out last time, and assuming these two are about going to run in parallel, July or August, you'll kick off this batch 0, and you'll probably be pretty mature in your RTP so that what's coming out of it could actually, in that one, be uniquely valid solutions to bring over in there for those firm loads that were in the RTP that justified those upgrades. Am I thinking about that remotely right, or how are y'all thinking about that?
Yeah, so, and, Barksdale, correct me if I'm not thinking about this correctly from your perspective. So let's say the 2028 RTP loads will have had to have gone through the batch study process. So think about the process. So 5841 is going to lay out some rules for an intermediate agreement. To get into the batch study, you will need to meet that intermediate agreement. That will not be sufficient to get into the 2028 RTP. So batch 5 or whatever, we're on at that point. To get into batch 5, you will need to meet that intermediate agreement those intermediate agreement requirements. You go through the batch study. At the end of the batch study, you need to meet the 5841 interconnection agreement requirements. And once you do that, then that load will then go into the planning forecast that is used in the 2028 RTP.
All that makes sense for 2028. Really,
Yes.
My question was around 2026, as it would apply to batch 0.
So I think 2026, I think we're in a different situation because 58480 points to the rule that will be coming out in 58481 for what is an interconnection agreement. But because when the 2026 RTP is starting, we don't have that 58481 rule. And so 58480, they included sort of an alternative approach for 2026 RTP for what loads should be included, because we don't have this other rule yet to define that, and we don't have this batch study process. We don't have all of that yet. So what is going into the 2026 RTP is that 58480 kind of special rules. But that does not mean that those rules apply to 2026 transmission studies, but those won't necessarily apply to any other studies going forward. So it's possible that a load that meets the 2026 RTP requirements as laid out in 58480 for inclusion, it's possible they may not meet the requirements in a subsequent year.
Got it. And we've all been talking about this as it applies to RTP, but I think what you just clarified and is in that approved rule is for any even RPG evaluation, ERCOT independent review of RPG evaluation, or for new submittals. I'm presuming you intend to use that same criteria, and anything that's in process already, you finish it under the criteria that was in place when it was submitted, or how are y'all thinking about that?
Yeah, I don't know if we have any transmission planning folks who are on the phone that want to clarify that.
Could you say it in an easy way, which is TBD?
I think that's the right way to say it. We are
Okay.
the landscape has changed, and we are factoring that in as we think about the batch study process. The rule just came out on Friday. Sorry. Building the airplane as we're flying it. But yeah, the rule just came out, was adopted on Friday, and we are thinking about how that will apply within the batch study process.
Yeah,
And RPG.
Yeah,
That's more importantly, the RPG.
Yeah, so circling back to what I said earlier, because a load is included in the 2026 RTP does not necessarily mean that it will qualify to be included in the batch 0 study. It's TBD.
All right. Anything else on that? All right. Well, three last points of business. So number one, let's see. Hold on one second. So able to get this in. So thank you. So sound was off, but what she shared is the idea. If the idea of bring your own gen is that load will curtail under a G-1, so loss of generator, and a N-1 contingency scenario, then BOI-OG and CLR are the same concept in practice. For this reason, while ERCOT suggests that stakeholders to put all the work done to date in one white paper concept list for an ERCOT-sponsored package, we would need ERCOT to opine very soon to give a common understanding of what they consider as an appropriate CLR configuration. And happy to send the white papers. Okay. So no, thank you so much, Ruth. All right. So Evan, you had something to share. So when we talk about the NPR, there's another NPR floating around that Evan wanted to share an update on.
Yep. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Avenil Lancium, just want to talk on behalf of the co-sponsors of NPR 1321. Just an element of full transparency, we plan on tabling that for the time being until we have a better idea of what ERCOT's plans are moving forward with this, which of course would include seeing their revision request language that they plan to submit soon. Just, Matt, really appreciate everything you've done here. Appreciate seeing all the stats laid out. Would encourage you to keep doing that as this process goes through. But yeah, we would love to keep using that NPR as a venue for productive discussion, but we definitely want to keep it tabled until we see what y'all have planned. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Evan. All right. So in terms of next steps, this workshop, so it says TBD. It is what I talked about earlier on. That is February 26th. So Thursday, February 26th will be the batch workshop number 3. Again, we're making a stop at LLWG next week just to talk about the framework that we're kind of operating in. So that's not a substantive discussion. That's a sharing where we're at if you're interested. And then again, I'll work to get these workshops onto the calendar as quickly as possible for March as ERCOT-sponsored workshops. I think that's it. We have a food truck outside. They love it if you get it. Then they'll keep coming back. So if you hit them on the way out, we'd appreciate it. And that is all we have. So we stand adjourned until February 26th. Thank y'all.